The herald's voice cracked on the Queen's name, and every hand on the dais found the hilt of something. "Her Majesty," he called out over the hall, "names her protector." Kellen Voss stood in the third row of witnesses, still in his gray dock coveralls, because no one had bothered to tell him to wear anything else, and did not understand that the ceremony had already turned toward him until the whole room turned with it. 200 nobles in silk and lacquered armor went silent enough that he could hear Queen Elira Vantine's skirts hiss against the marble as she stepped down from the throne. "I choose Kellen Voss," she said, "dockworker of the ferry quarter." Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Then Regent Marshal Dreith Corvin's chair scraped back so hard it left a white scar in the floor, and somewhere behind Kellen a woman laughed once, short and disbelieving, before she caught herself. That was how it started, not with a battle, with a name nobody in that hall wanted to hear, spoken by the one woman in the Dominion whose word could not be unspoken. Kellen had not planned on being at the Ascension Rite at all. He had planned on being under a coolant manifold on Pier 9, replacing a valve seal that had been weeping refrigerant for 2 weeks while his supervisor filed the requisition in triplicate, because that was what the ferry quarter ran on: patched systems, deferred maintenance, and human labor cheap enough that nobody higher up cared how it got done. He had gotten the summons that morning. A Viren household courier in blue livery, standing at the gate of the human district with a folded parchment bearing a seal Kellen didn't recognize, telling him he was required at the palace by second bell. He had assumed it was about the pier accident. He had assumed wrong. Now he stood in a hall built for beings a head taller than him on average. Ceilings vaulted so high the incense smoke pooled in slow gray rings near the top, mosaic floor telling some old war story in colored stone he'd never had time to learn to read. And the Queen of the Viren Dominion was looking directly at him across 200 strangers like he was the only person in the room worth seeing. She did not look away from him, even as Dreith rose to object. That was the first thing Kellen noticed about her, and it would not be the last time it mattered. "Majesty," Dreith's voice filled the hall without seeming to strain for it, a trained instrument, silver hair swept back from a face carved by 140 years of court survival. "This is the Ascension Rite. The naming of your protector is not a courtesy appointment. It is a bond of blood law unbroken for 11 generations, always given to a warrior of proven caste. You would give it to—" His eyes swept Kellen once, head to boots, the way a man inventories a shipping crate, a laborer. "A human laborer." "I would give it," Elira said, "to the one man in this Dominion who pulled me out of a collapsing pier with his own hands and did not once ask who I was before he did it." That landed on the hall like a struck bell. Kellen felt every eye in the room shift to him at once, a physical pressure, and did his best not to flinch under it. He remembered the pier. He hadn't known she was the Queen. He still barely believed it. 6 months back, Ferry Quarter Pier 6 had buckled under a supply barge that never should have been cleared to dock, rusted mooring clamps, a foreman who'd signed off on an inspection he never ran, and 40 tons of cargo shifting wrong on a falling tide. Kellen had been 40 meters away replacing a valve when the deck went. He remembered the sound most, a groan like something enormous breaking a bone, and then the screaming. He'd pulled people out for 11 minutes before he found her. A slight woman in a plain gray traveling cloak wedged under a support strut with her leg pinned and her face gone the color of ash, blood matting silver-white hair to her temple. And she had not screamed once, not even when he'd had to brace the strut with his own shoulder and drag her free by the arms while it groaned above them both. He remembered her eyes, pale violet, wide, steady even through the pain, watching him work instead of watching the wreckage. He remembered she had thanked him by name, his name, off the Union patch stitched to his coveralls, and that he had told her to hold still and stop talking so he could set the leg before it got worse, because that was what you did, rank be damned. He had not known her name. She had not offered it. He had assumed she was a minor functionary doing an inspection. Nobody wanted to walk with her, because that was the kind of assignment the household gave to people it didn't value, human or Viren both. He had asked if she was all right 3 times before he asked what her name was, and by the time he'd gotten an evasive answer, and a medical transport had finally arrived 40 minutes too slow, because human quarters always waited longest, she was gone into a curtained litter, and he'd gone back to pulling the next person out from under the next fallen beam. He had thought about her exactly once since then, wondering if the leg had healed clean. Apparently it had. Apparently it had healed clean enough that she had spent 6 months finding out who had said it. "You gave your bond oath to a stranger who did not bow," Dreeth said now, recovering his composure, turning the objection toward the wider hall instead of the Queen directly, playing to the room the way court survivors always did. "A man with no house, no rank, no formal combat record recognized by the Dominion. This is not devotion, Majesty. This is a wound still healing, making a decision your throne cannot afford." "My throne," Elira said, "has had 11 protectors drawn from the Bladeguard caste in the last 40 years, General Wren's own record among them, and 6 of them are dead, and my mother is dead, and the wound on my leg from 6 months ago says the Bladeguard was 3 corridors away doing an inspection tour when the pier went down. This man was 40 meters away and came anyway." She let that sit. "I am not choosing sentiment, Marshal. I am choosing the only account of this Dominion's protection I have personally tested." Kellen realized distantly that his hands had curled into fists at his sides and made himself unclench them. This was not his fight yet. He did not know what it was going to cost him to let her make it his fight, but he understood, with the flat, clear-headed calm that had gotten him through 2 tours in the Corps, and out the other side alive when men better trained than him hadn't made it, that whatever this was, it was already happening, and the only choice left to him was how he stood inside it. An old man near the front of the hall stepped forward, before Dreeth could rebuild his argument. Commander Thasser Wren, first blade of the Queen's Guard, hair gone the color of old iron, a scar tracking from his jaw to his collar that Kellen would later learn had been earned holding a breach at Elira's coronation 8 years prior. He did not look pleased. He did not look angry either. He looked like a man doing arithmetic he did not like the answer to. "Majesty," Wren said, "the rite requires he be tested before the bond is sealed. That much law does still stand, even for you." "Then test him," Elira said. Wren turned to Kellen for the first time, and his eyes were not unkind exactly. They were assessing, the way you'd assess a length of cable you were about to trust your weight to. "Dockworker, have you ever killed a man?" The hall had gone very quiet again. Kellen thought about lying, decided against it, decided the Queen deserved better than a protector who started with a lie in front of her whole court. "2," he said, "during the armistice skirmishes, both of them were trying to kill people under my command first." "Do you know the sword?" "No." "The pulse lance?" "No." Someone near Dreeth laughed again, less careful about hiding it this time. Wren's jaw tightened, but he didn't turn toward the sound. "What do you know?" Kellen thought about the 11 years since his discharge, the ferry quarter docks, the 12-hour shifts, the pipe wrenches and pressure gauges, and the improvised toolkit he'd built from scavenged parts because the Union never got a full requisition approved on time, the 2 riots he'd talked down before they turned into stampedes, the 3 times he'd carried a coworker with a crushed hand the 2 kilometers to the Human District Infirmary because the transport queue was backed up for Viren's first. "I know how to keep working when something's trying to fail," he said. "I know how to get people out of a collapsing structure without getting them or myself killed doing it. I know how to hit something hard enough that it stops being a problem, if it comes to that, though I'd rather it didn't." Wren studied him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, something that was almost approval moved behind the old commander's eyes. "That," Wren said, "is a better answer than half the Bladeguard candidates I have tested this decade." He turned back to the Queen. "The law requires testing, majesty, not perfection. I will accept him provisionally. The bond can be sealed tonight. Whether he survives to see it renewed a year from now is a different question, one the whole hall just heard the marshal make into a threat instead of a courtesy." Dreith's face did not change, which told Kellen more than an open reaction would have. A man who could hold his expression that still through a public accusation had practiced holding it still through worse. "I take no offense at Commander Wren's reading of my words," Dreith said smoothly. "I only observe that this Dominion has enemies who will read the Queen's choice as weakness. A human protector, untested by our law, untrained in our arms, chosen for a rescue any competent officer would have performed. It invites exactly the kind of contempt that gets queens killed. I hope, for all our sakes, that the marshal's caution proves unnecessary." He bowed, precise and correct, and left the hall with 6 of his own household guard falling into step behind him, and Kellen watched him go and understood, without being able to prove a single piece of it yet, that the man had just promised something and called it a warning. The bond sealing itself took less time than the argument that preceded it. Wren walked Kellen through the words, a short oath, older than the Dominion's current dynasty, promising his body between the Queen and harm for as long as the bond held or death released it. Elira spoke her half of it facing him, her pale violet eyes steady on his the entire time, and when she pressed 2 fingers briefly to the inside of his wrist, the old gesture, Wren murmured, that sealed it, skin to pulse, nothing more than that, nothing improper, just proof that a heartbeat had been offered and witnessed. Kellen felt something settle into place in his chest that he did not have a word for yet. "Thank you," she said quietly, for his ears only, once the formal part was done and the hall had begun its slow, muttering exodus, "for not making me repeat the request 3 times before you agreed." "You didn't ask," Kellen said. "You told the room." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Would you have said no if I had asked?" "No," he admitted. "But I'd have liked being asked." "Noted," she said, and this time the almost smile made it all the way. "Protector Voss, try to survive the night. I would rather not test Commander Wren's arithmetic quite so soon." He did not know, when she said it, how literally he was about to have to take that instruction. They gave him rooms adjoining the Queen's private wing. Small, spare, more space than his flat in the ferry quarter, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. A Viren attendant, a young woman named Sale with silver-gray eyes and the particular formal stiffness of someone new enough to her post to still be nervous about getting it wrong, showed him where the Queen's chamber lay relative to his, walked him twice through the corridor's turns until he'd have been able to run it blind, and left him with a short blade he did not know how to use and a longer one he understood better. A length of pipe iron he'd asked for instead. Because a tool he trusted beat a weapon he didn't. He did not sleep. He sat in the dark near the door that connected his room to the Queen's private corridor, listening to the palace settle around him, stone cooling, distant water systems cycling, the occasional footfall of a guard rotation 2 floors down, and thought about Dreith's face holding perfectly still through a public accusation, and did not like the shape the thought was taking. The attack came at the 4th hour past midnight, when the palace was at its quietest and the guard rotation was thinnest. He heard it before he understood what he was hearing, a faint scrape of metal on stone from the direction of the Queen's terrace, wrong in a building where every door he'd been shown had hinges oiled to silence. Then Sale's voice, cut off halfway through what should have been an alarm. Kellen was moving before he finished thinking about it, pipe iron in hand, out his door and into the Queen's corridor at a dead run. 3 figures in matte black wrap armor stood over Sale's crumpled body near the terrace doors. She was breathing. He registered that in the half-second his eyes found her, breathing but out cold, a dart still quivering in her shoulder, and a 4th figure was already through the far door into Elira's chamber. Kellen did not slow down to think about the odds. He put his shoulder into the nearest of the three before they'd fully registered him coming, drove the man into the stone wall hard enough to hear something crack that wasn't the wall, and swung the pipe iron in a short, brutal arc that caught the second across the forearm as a curved blade came up, hard enough to fold the arm the wrong way. The third came at him with a short spike knife aimed low for his gut, and Kellen took the cut across his forearm rather than his stomach, felt it open hot and sharp, and used the half-second the assassin spent expecting him to fold to drive the pipe iron into the man's throat instead. 3 down, one still standing with a broken forearm and a curved blade he could no longer properly hold, backing toward the terrace rail. Kellen didn't chase him. He went through the far door instead, into the Queen's chamber, blood running warm down his arm and dripping off his knuckles, pipe iron still up. The fourth assassin had Elira backed against the far wall, a thin curved blade at her throat, and she was not screaming. She was standing very still, hands loose at her sides, pale violet eyes locked on the assassin's masked face with an expression Kellen would spend a long time afterward trying to name, not fear, exactly. Fury held very tightly in check, and underneath the fury, calculation. The assassin's eyes flicked to Kellen in the doorway. Blood-soaked, breathing hard, pipe iron raised, 3 of the assassin's own crew down behind him in less than a minute. And Kellen watched something happen in the set of the man's shoulders that he did not have language for yet either, but would come to recognize over the following months as the specific stillness of someone recalculating whether the contract was worth dying for. "Put it down," Kellen said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. "Or I put you down the way I put the other 3 down. Your choice. You've got about 2 seconds to make it." The blade did not move from Elira's throat, but the hand holding it had begun, almost imperceptibly, to shake. "You're not trained," the assassin said, voice muffled behind the wrap mask testing him. "You're a laborer." "I'm the man who just killed one of your crew with a pipe," Kellen said. "Training's not the part you should be worried about right now." For 1 full second nobody moved. Then, from the terrace behind Kellen, he heard the 4th crew member, the one with the broken arm, say something low and fast in a dialect Kellen didn't know, and whatever it meant, it made the assassin at Elira's throat go rigid. The blade came away from her neck. Not thrown down gently, dropped, clattering against the stone floor like it had suddenly become too heavy to hold, and the assassin backed away from her with both empty hands raised, eyes still on Kellen, and Kellen understood, watching it happen, that he had just witnessed something that had nothing to do with the 2 seconds he'd given the man to decide. He'd witnessed a professional recognize, in real time, that the job had stopped being winnable. "Guards!" Elira's voice cracked out, finally, sharp and commanding, and from somewhere down the corridor came the sound of running feet, too late, always too late, but coming. The 4th assassin was already backing toward the terrace rail, hands still up, and Kellen let him go rather than leave Elira's side. That was the whole job now, he understood, standing there bleeding onto the palace floor with 3 bodies behind him and the Queen's pale violet eyes fixed on him like she was seeing something for the first time. Not gratitude, exactly. Recognition. The same look, he realized, she'd given him from the throne dais 6 hours earlier. The assassin went over the rail and was gone into the dark before the first guard reached the door. Elira crossed the room to him in 4 quick steps and took his bleeding arm in both her hands without asking permission, turning it toward the lamplight, and her fingers were not steady, he noticed, even though her voice had been. "You're cut," she said. "You're alive," he said. "Trade seems fair." She looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, while behind them Commander Wren's voice rose in the corridor, sharp with fury and fear both, demanding to know how 4 assassins had made it past a household guard rotation that should have made it impossible. "Minutes," Elira said quietly, almost to herself. "I chose you 6 hours ago, and it took them until the 4th hour past midnight to decide you were worth killing over. She looked down at the dropped blade on the floor, then back up at him. They didn't retreat because they lost, Protector Voss. 4 trained killers do not lose to one man with a pipe in under 90 seconds and simply decide to leave. They retreated because something about you told them the contract had already failed before it started. Kellen thought about the assassin's shaking hand, the blade dropping like it had turned to lead. "I don't know what that something was," he said honestly. "No," Elira said, "but I intend to find out. And so, I suspect, does whoever sent them." Down the corridor, Sale was stirring, a household physician already crouched over her. Wren was barking orders that sent guards fanning out toward the terrace and the grounds below. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, in a district Kellen had not yet seen, a man was receiving word that the first attempt on the Queen's new protector's life had failed in under 2 minutes, and was already beginning to plan the second. By dawn, the physician had closed the cut on Kellen's forearm with a device that stung worse than the wound itself and left a thin silver seam of scar tissue instead of stitches. And Commander Wren had questioned him 3 separate times about the fight, each time circling back to the same detail. "You had no formal training," Wren said, for the 3rd time, pacing the small infirmary chamber with his hands clasped behind his back. "And yet you took 3 of the cindered chains people down in under a minute, and the 4th broke discipline and fled rather than press an advantage he still technically held." "I got lucky," Kellen said. "You did not get lucky," Wren said. "I have led the Blade Guard for 30 years. I have watched trained soldiers freeze at their first real cut. You bled from a wound that should have slowed you, and you did not slow. That is not luck. That is something else, and until I understand what it is, I cannot properly protect the Queen around you, because I do not know what I am protecting. I spent 2 tours pulling wounded men off battlefields that didn't care if I was tired," Kellen said. "You stop being afraid of your own blood pretty fast when other people's is the thing you're actually worried about." Wren studied him for a long moment, the scar along his jaw pulling tight as he considered that. "The cindered chain," he said finally, "is not a street gang, Protector Voss. They are a contract guild, old as the Dominion's worst wars, and they do not send 4 operatives after a single target without an employer wealthy enough to make failure survivable. Which means someone in this palace, or close to it, wanted you dead within a day of your naming, and wanted it badly enough to risk exposure doing it." "Dreeth," Kellen said. "Perhaps." Wren's mouth thinned. "The Marshal is not a fool. He will not have left a thread anyone can pull. But 4 operatives sent within hours of a public objection is not subtle, and subtlety has always been the Marshal's preferred weapon. That troubles me more than the attack itself." It troubled Kellen too, though it took him another 2 days to understand exactly why, sitting in on his first formal council session as Protector. A position that, he was rapidly learning, came with far more scrutiny than authority. He stood at Elira's shoulder through 3 hours of trade disputes and border allocations, said nothing, and watched. He watched Dreeth speak with perfect, unhurried courtesy about a supply convoy delay, and never once mention the attack, and never once look at Kellen directly, and understood that the absence of a reaction was itself the tell. A man with nothing to hide would have asked, at least once, whether the investigation had found anything. Dreeth asked nothing. He watched, too, how the rest of the council treated Elira, not with contempt exactly, but with the particular careful condescension reserved for someone whose authority everyone privately agreed was provisional. Lord Vesserin of the Western Holdings addressed most of his remarks past her to Dreeth, as though the Marshal were the one who needed convincing. General Thess of the Border Fleet used her title but not her name, 3 separate times, in a way that Kellen suspected was not accidental. Elira absorbed all of it without visible reaction, made her rulings clearly and without hesitation, and Kellen began to understand, watching the small, constant erosion happen in real time, That the assassination attempt 2 nights before was not an aberration in how this court treated its queen. It was a more violent version of the same current running under everything else in the room. "They do that every session?" he asked her afterward, once the chamber had cleared and they were alone in the corridor beyond it. "Every session," Elira said, tired in a way she hadn't let show in the room itself. "My mother ruled for 30 years and buried 3 husbands, and they still spoke of her decisions as though some man behind the throne must have made them for her. I have ruled 8 years on my own, survived 2 assassination attempts before yours, and Lord Vesserin still cannot bring himself to say my name to my face." She glanced at him. "You noticed?" "Hard not to. Most don't. Or they notice and decide it isn't worth the political cost of mentioning it." She started walking again, and he fell into step beside her, the position he'd occupy for most of the following months, half a step back and to her left, close enough to close the distance in under a second, far enough to let her walk like a queen and not a guarded prisoner. "Why did you notice, Protector Voss?" "I spent 11 years in the ferry quarter watching foremen talk past union reps to whoever they figured was really in charge," Kellen said. "Learned to spot it. Guess it doesn't look that different up here, just with better lighting." That earned him the almost smile again, brief and real. "No," she agreed. "It does not look that different at all." The second attempt came 9 days later, and it did not come with blades. Kellen noticed it first as a smell, faint, sweetish, wrong, rising off a gift basket of pale amber fruit sent to the Queen's private chamber from an unnamed well-wisher, the kind of anonymous courtesy gift that arrived by the dozen after any public ceremony. Sale had already unwrapped it, already lifted one of the fruits to set on the Queen's evening tray, when Kellen's hand closed over her wrist. "Don't," he said. Sale froze, startled, and Elira looked up from the reports spread across her desk. "Kellen, something's off about the smell." He leaned closer to the basket without touching it, breathing through his mouth the way he'd learned to when checking a coolant leak for the telltale sweetness of a cracked line. "I worked 11 years around chemical seals. This isn't fruit going bad. This is something added." Elira's physician confirmed it within the hour. A contact toxin painted into the fruit's skin, undetectable by taste until it was too late, designed to mimic the symptoms of a natural cardiac failure so precisely that without Kellen's warning, the Queen's death that evening would have been recorded as illness and nothing more. No blade, no forced door, no evidence of intrusion at all. A poison delivered by courtesy, through a gift no one would think to question, sent by a name that traced back through 3 false fronts to a shell trading house registered on a border world that did business. The investigators eventually determined, almost exclusively with the Marshal's household. Almost exclusively, not conclusively. Dreeth's fingerprints were never on the ledger itself. "He is careful," Wren said grimly. When the report came in, the 3 of them gathered in the Queen's private study with the offending basket long since removed and destroyed. "He builds 3 walls between himself and the act every time. We will never catch him with a blade in his own hand." "Then we don't need his hand," Kellen said. "We need the pattern. Blades once, poison once. He's testing what gets through. Means he'll try something else next, something we haven't guarded against yet because he's cataloging what doesn't work." Elira looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize. Not surprise anymore precisely, but something adjacent to it, the particular attentiveness of someone recalibrating how much weight to put behind a person's opinion. "You think like a man who has watched systems fail before." "Every system I've ever worked on fails somewhere," Kellen said. "The question's never if. It's finding the weak seam before the pressure does." "And where is our weak seam, Protector?" He thought about it, really thought, the way he'd think through a pier's load-bearing failure points before a storm, and answered honestly. "Right now, it's information. He's getting inside knowledge fast enough to move within days of every decision you make. That's not luck, and it's not a lone spy. That's someone inside this palace feeding him a live schedule. Ren's jaw tightened. You are accusing my blade guard. I'm not accusing anybody yet, Kellen said. I'm telling you what the pattern says, same as I'd tell a supervisor a pipe's about to go before it blows. Not because I know which weld failed, but because I know what a failing system looks like from the outside. You want to catch him, you don't chase the assassins. You watch who already knows things they shouldn't. It took another 11 days to find the leak. A junior clerk in the household scheduling office. A young Viren man named Corval who had been quietly selling the Queen's movements to an intermediary for 2 years. Initially for money owed on a gambling debt, later out of simple fear, once the intermediary made clear what would happen to his family if he stopped. Kellen was the one who caught the pattern, a scheduling change made only within the clerk's office that reached an ambush point on the Queen's route to the Eastern Shrine before she'd even left the palace grounds, a coincidence too precise to be coincidence. And Ren was the one who broke the clerk in an interrogation that lasted 4 hours and ended with the young man weeping and naming names he did not fully understand the weight of. Dreeth's name was not among them. The intermediary's was, but the intermediary had vanished from his registered address within a day of the clerk's arrest, and the trail went cold at a border checkpoint that, Ren noted with quiet fury, fell under the marshal's own fleet jurisdiction. He is 3 walls deep again, Ren said. Always 3 walls. But something had shifted in the palace by then, in a way that had nothing to do with Dreeth's careful distance from his own schemes. Word of the leak's discovery had spread through the household staff within a day. Kellen Voss, the human protector everyone had expected to be dead or disgraced within the week, had found the traitor 2 attempts and 11 days before Ren's own investigators had gotten close. The guards who rotated past his door at night stopped looking at him with the flat, faintly amused contempt he'd grown used to in his first week, and started instead to nod when he passed. Sale found him alone on the terrace one evening, 3 weeks into the bond, watching the sun go down orange and heavy over Versailles spires. She was still nervous around him in a way she wasn't around the Viren staff, but she'd stopped flinching when he spoke first. May I ask you something, Protector Voss? Kellen's fine. Kellen, she tried the name carefully like it might not fit right in her mouth. The night of the attack, why did you come for the Queen's chamber first instead of helping me? I was closer. I had already fallen. He'd thought about that question himself in the weeks since and had an honest answer ready. You were breathing, he said. I checked in half a second, saw your chest moving, saw the dart wasn't a killing dose. She wasn't in the room where I could check on her the same way. When you don't know, you go toward the danger you can't measure first and deal with the danger you can measure after. That's not because you mattered less. It's because I could tell you were going to live, and I couldn't tell that about her yet. Sale was quiet for a moment, turning that over. The blade guard would not have explained it that way. They would have said duty required it and left it there. Duty's the reason I stayed in this job past the first day, Kellen said. It's not the reason I do the math the way I do it. That part's just paying attention. Anyone can learn to pay attention if they decide it matters enough. The Queen thinks you were chosen by something like fortune, Sale said. The kitchen staff say it is a kind of magic, that a human could do what you did with a length of pipe. I do not think it is either. She looked at him more directly than she had in the 3 weeks he'd known her. I think you simply decided, a long time before you ever met her, that people mattered more than the rules said they should, and you have been practicing that decision every day since, so that when the moment came, you already knew how to make it without stopping to think. Kellen didn't have a quick answer to that, and didn't try to find one. They stood together at the rail a while longer, watching Versailles' lights come up gold against the darkening sky, and somewhere below them in the city, in a private chamber behind 3 locked doors, Regent Marshal Dreeth Corvin reviewed a report on a failed poisoning and a broken clerk and began, with the patience of a man who had outlasted 6 changes of dynasty by never rushing an execution, to plan a third attempt, one that would not rely on hired blades or borrowed poisons. One that would strike at something the human protector could not simply outfight or outthink, because it would not be aimed at the Queen's body at all. It would be aimed at convincing the entire Dominion that choosing him had been a mistake. Dreith's third move came dressed as tradition, which was, Kellen would come to understand, the most dangerous shape anything in this court could take. It arrived at the next full council session in the form of a formal petition, read aloud by a court herald in the flat, careful cadence reserved for matters of ancient law. A trial of worth, invoked under a statute so old that 2 of the assembled lords had to be reminded of its existence by the palace archivist before they could vote on whether it still applied. The statute held that any bond appointment made outside the recognized warrior castes could be formally challenged within 1 turning of the season by any noble of sufficient rank, who could put forward a champion to test the appointee in open combat. Not to the death, the old law was specific on that point, but to clear submission or incapacity. If the appointee yielded or fell, the bond was void and the Queen was required, by the same ancient statute, to name a protector from the recognized castes within a week. "You cannot be serious," Elira said, when Dreith had finished reading his own petition into the record with the same unhurried courtesy he brought to everything. "This statute has not been invoked in 6 generations. Because in 6 generations, Dreith said, no monarch has appointed a protector so plainly unqualified that the court felt compelled to test him by ancient right rather than trust the throne's judgment. I take no pleasure in this, Majesty. I take considerably less pleasure in watching your safety rest on a man who has survived 2 attempts through luck and instinct rather than training. Let the trial settle the question the whole Dominion is already asking in private. If he is as capable as events suggest, he has nothing to fear from proving it openly." It was, Kellen understood immediately, a trap constructed with real elegance. Refuse the trial, and Dreith would spend every session afterward reminding the court that the human protector wouldn't submit to the Dominion's own ancient law proof, in the telling, that he had something to hide. Accept it, and Dreith would simply put forward whichever Bladeguard champion he judged most likely to break a man who'd never held a proper sword in his life. "I'll do it," Kellen said, before Elira could answer for him. She turned to him sharply. "You do not have to accept this." "If I don't, he wins anyway, just slower," Kellen said, low enough that it didn't carry past their end of the table. "Better to lose it fighting than lose it by looking like I was afraid to." "You will not lose it," Wren said, from Kellen's other side, with more certainty than Kellen felt himself entitled to. "You have 3 weeks before the trial can be formally scheduled. That is enough time for me to teach you enough to survive an opponent who has spent 40 years learning to kill with a blade, provided you are willing to work harder in those 3 weeks than you have worked at anything in your life. I've dug coolant trenches by hand in a heat wave because the machine broke and the shipment couldn't wait," Kellen said. "I think I can manage 3 weeks of getting hit by an old man with a stick." Wren's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You will not think that in a week." He didn't. Wren trained him in a stripped, sunlit chamber in the palace's lower levels, 6 hours a day for 3 weeks, and Kellen came out of the first session with a split lip, a bruised rib, and a grudging, painful understanding of exactly how much a Bladeguard's 40 years of training actually meant. Wren did not go easy on him, could not afford to, he explained flatly, because a trial opponent certainly wouldn't. And by the 5th day, Kellen had learned to read the older man's blade work well enough to stop getting hit in the same 3 places twice. He was not becoming a swordsman in 3 weeks. He understood that plainly, and so, watching him, did Wren. "You will never outfence a Bladeguard champion trained since childhood," Wren told him bluntly. On the 8th day, both of them sitting on the training floor catching their breath, Kellen's knuckles wrapped and bleeding through the wrap anyway. "So, we are not going to try to make you one. We are going to make you into something the trial's champion has never had to fight before, because the blade guard has never needed to learn it. Which is a man who does not fight like he is afraid to lose, Ren said. Every duelist I have trained in 30 years fights with some part of his mind counting the cost of failure, his rank, his family's honor, his place in the caste. You have none of that weighing on you. You have only her. He nodded once toward the door beyond which, 3 floors up, Elira was holding counsel without her protector at her shoulder for the first time in weeks. That is not a weakness, Voss. In my experience, it is the single most dangerous thing a fighting man can carry into a duel, because it means he has already decided the outcome does not change what he is willing to do to protect it. Kellen thought about the peer 6 months before he'd ever known her name, and the terrace 3 weeks ago with a blade at her throat, and understood, in a way he hadn't quite let himself articulate before, that Ren was right, that somewhere in the space between those 2 nights, without ever deciding to, he had stopped thinking of this as a job. Elira came to watch 2 of the training sessions, standing in the doorway in plain traveling clothes rather than court dress, and said nothing through either of them, though Kellen was intensely aware of her presence the entire time, in a way that cost him a bruised jaw the second time when Ren caught him distracted. Afterward, icing the jaw in the corridor outside, she found him there without an escort, which he was fairly sure Ren would have had opinions about if he'd known. You didn't have to accept the trial, she said again, for perhaps the 4th time since the council session. You didn't have to choose me on the dais either, Kellen said. But you did, and I figure that means something ought to cost me too, or the whole thing's just you taking a risk I never had to earn. That is not how I think of it. I know, it's how I think of it. He lowered the ice pack, met her eyes. You pulled a leg free of rubble under a struck that could have come down on both of us, and you didn't scream while I said it, and you thanked a stranger by his name off a work patch instead of demanding to know who he thought he was, touching you without permission. I've thought about that a lot more than I probably should have these 6 months. When you named me on that dais, it didn't feel like charity. It felt like you'd decided something about who I was, and I still want to be worth having decided that about. Elira was quiet for a long moment, her pale violet eyes unreadable in the corridor's low light. My mother used to say a monarch's whole education is learning which people to trust with the truth before they have earned the right to hear it, she said finally. I have spent 8 years on this throne being very careful about that. I was not careful with you. I told you the truth about my choice in front of 200 nobles who wanted to hear anything else. I am not certain, even now, that it was wise. Was it true? Yes. Then it doesn't much matter if it was wise, Kellen said. True's usually worth more. She looked at him for a moment longer, something working behind her composed expression that he couldn't quite name. And then, because a guard's footsteps had begun echoing from the corridor's far end, and because whatever this was between them had not yet found a shape either of them was ready to say aloud. She only nodded once and walked on, leaving Kellen standing there with a melting ice pack and the distinct, unfamiliar sensation of having said something that mattered more than he'd meant it to. The trial itself took place 11 days later, in the palace's outer courtyard, under a bright cold noon sky, before every noble house that could claim standing to attend. Dreeth's champion was a blade guard's second blade named Korash, younger than Ren, built like a wall, with a reputation Kellen had heard whispered in the training halls for finishing duels in under 2 minutes. Kellen lasted 4. It was not elegant. Ren had been right that 3 weeks would never make him a swordsman, and Korash's blade found him twice in the first minute alone, shallow cuts across the shoulder and the outside of his thigh that stung like fire and bled freely down the courtyard stone. But Kellen had spent 3 weeks learning something other than sword work. He had learned to read Korash's balance the way he'd once learned to read a strained pipe joint under load, watching for the tell that came a half-second before failure, and when Korash overcommitted to what should have been a finishing strike, certain a wounded, half-trained human had nothing left to offer. Kellen stepped inside the blade's reach instead of away from it, took the strike as a graze across his ribs rather than a killing line, and drove his forehead and both fists into the space Korash's confidence had left open. It was not a technique Ren had taught him. It was a bar fight from a decade of fairy quarter nights, applied to a man who had never once in his career had to plan for an opponent willing to trade a cut for a clinch. Korash went down hard enough to crack the courtyard stone under his shoulder blade, and did not get back up before the trial's marshal, a neutral judge from a border house with no stake in either faction, called the bout in Kellen's favor. The courtyard was silent for a moment, the same silence Kellen remembered from the Ascension Hall, and then Ren's voice broke it, carrying clear across the stone. "There," the old commander said to the assembled houses, to Dreeth standing rigid and unreadable at the courtyard's edge, "is a man who fights like the universe already told him he was dead, and he came anyway, and decided the outcome would not be decided by anyone but him. I have trained Blade Guard champions for 30 years. I have never once trained that into a man. Either he was born with it, or 6 months ago, on a collapsing pier, he found it and never let it go again. It was, Kellen understood later, the closest thing to the old god tier complements the court traded in, the kind normally reserved for warriors who'd earned legendary names in battle. And Ren had spent it on a dockworker with a pipe wrench, in front of the entire Dominion's assembled nobility, and meant every word of it. Dreeth said nothing at all. He turned and left the courtyard before the physicians had even finished binding Kellen's wounds, and this time there was no smooth courtesy in the set of his shoulders, only the flat, controlled fury of a man watching a second plan collapse in as many months. But it was Elira's face Kellen found first, once the crowd's noise had risen up around him, and the physicians were cutting away his bloodied sleeve, and she was not smiling, not exactly. Her eyes were too bright, too fixed on him, something in her expression that looked less like triumph and more like a woman realizing, in public, in front of 200 witnesses, exactly how much she had already come to need him to survive. "You are bleeding on my courtyard, Protector Voss," she said, when she reached him, her voice carefully light and her hands, when they closed over his, not steady at all. "Occupational hazard," Kellen said, "comes with the job." "So it seems." She held his hand a moment longer than the formality required, and neither of them pulled away first. "Try, for once, to let the next attempt on your life be less dramatic." He would not get that particular wish granted. But for 11 days after the trial, the palace was quiet in a way it had not been since his naming, Dreeth withdrawn to his own estates on some diplomatic pretext. The court's murmured contempt for the human protector curdling, gradually, into something that looked almost like respect. And Kellen let himself believe, for those 11 days, that the worst of it might already be behind him. He was wrong about that too. Dreeth had not withdrawn to lick a wound. He had withdrawn to finish building the only plan left to him, one that would not test the human protector's worth again, because the marshal had learned, in a cracked courtyard stone and a public humiliation, that testing him only made him more dangerous. The next plan would not test Kellen Voss at all. It would simply try to make sure he was not standing in the right place when it happened. The 11 quiet days ended with an invitation Elira could not refuse. A diplomatic summit at the border city of Havenmere, where 3 neighboring dominions and 2 independent trade consortiums would gather to renegotiate the tariff accords that kept half the Dominion's shipping lanes solvent. Her mother had attended every summit in 30 years of rule without missing one. Skipping this one, so soon after the trial, would read to every watching power as weakness, and Elira knew it as well as Dreeth did. "He wants me there," she said, studying the summit roster in her private study the night before departure, Kellen standing at her shoulder reading the same document upside down. "He proposed the location himself, 3 months ago, long before your naming. Havenmere sits at the edge of 3 jurisdictions. Palace law does not fully reach that far." Blade Guard protocols become advisory rather than binding once we cross the border marker. Meaning if something happens there, Kellen said, nobody's obligated to answer for how it happened. Meaning precisely that. She set the roster down. I considered sending you home and traveling with Wren's full detachment instead. It would be the safer choice on paper. But I have watched you find a poisoned gift by its smell and a traitor by a scheduling pattern nobody else noticed. And I have watched you take a beating that should have ended a duel in 90 seconds and turn it into a win in the 4th minute instead, Elira said. I do not think the safer choice on paper is actually the safer choice. I think Dreeth is counting on exactly that kind of reasoning to get me somewhere without you. They traveled to Havenmere with a reduced escort by court standards. Wren's insistence, 20 Blade Guard rather than the usual 80, small enough to move fast, disciplined enough to trust each one individually. And Kellen spent the 2-day transit doing what he'd learned to do best, reading the structure of things for weak seams. He studied the summit hall's floor plans until he had them memorized, walked the actual corridors twice on arrival before the first session even convened, noted every door, every vent shaft, every place a man could hide a device or a blade, and reported his findings to Wren each evening in a level of detail that made the old commander, by the second night, stop questioning why a dockworker's instincts kept outperforming trained soldiers and simply start listening. The summit's 3rd day was the tariff session, the one that mattered most, the one every Dominion's delegation would attend in full, the one Dreeth had specifically requested be moved from the smaller council chamber to the Grand Hall to accommodate the full assembly. Kellen didn't like the Grand Hall from the moment he walked it. Too many entrances, a vaulted ceiling with load-bearing supports he recognized, with a dock foreman's eye, as older construction patched with newer material. A renovation done cheap, done fast, done by someone who hadn't cared whether it held for 100 years or 10. He mentioned it to Wren the night before, who had the hall inspected by Summit Security and received assurances that the structure had been certified sound within the last 5 years by Havenmere's own engineers. Certified by whom? Kellen asked. And does that certifier answer to anyone with a stake in this summit? Wren did not have an answer to that, and by the time he tried to get one, it was already too late to change the venue without causing exactly the kind of diplomatic incident the summit existed to avoid. The device went off 19 minutes into the tariff session, planted not in the hall itself, but in the support column Kellen had flagged the night before old construction, patched cheap, exactly the kind of structural weak seam a saboteur with engineering knowledge would choose over a wall no one would think twice about. It was not, Kellen would understand afterward, aimed at killing everyone in the hall outright. It was aimed at bringing down enough of the ceiling near the dais that, in the chaos and the dust and the screaming, a second team already positioned among the observers could reach the Queen before her own guard could form up around her. Kellen felt the floor shudder a half-second before the sound reached him, the specific low groan of a structure failing that he'd heard once before, on a collapsing pier, and that his body remembered faster than his conscious mind could name it. He did not wait to confirm what was happening. He was already moving, already driving through the crowd toward the dais, already shouting Elira's name, when the ceiling section above the dais gave way in a roar of stone and dust and falling support beams. He reached her with less than a second to spare, threw his own body over hers as the first beam came down, took the impact across his back and shoulders instead of letting it reach her, felt something give, a rib, maybe two, the pain arriving distant and strange through the adrenaline, and held his position over her through the longer, grinding collapse of the section behind them, stone and dust raining down around them both while the rest of the hall dissolved into screaming chaos. When the worst of it stopped, he was still conscious, still covering her, blood running from a cut above his eye into the dust already coating his face, and Elira was pressed beneath him against the dais floor, one hand fisted in the fabric of his shirt, both of them breathing hard in the sudden ringing silence. "Kellen," her voice was raw with dust and fear both. "Kellen, are you still here?" he managed. "Don't move yet. Second team's coming if I read this right, and they'll be expecting the collapse to have done their work for them." He was right. Through the settling dust, three figures in Havenmere trade livery, cover identities. He understood instantly. Not real delegation staff, were converging on the dais with weapons already drawn, moving fast through the panicking crowd toward what they expected to be a wounded, undefended target. What they found instead was a protector who had absorbed a ceiling's worth of falling stone and was still standing between them and the queen, blood-streaked, dust-caked, one arm hanging wrong at the shoulder where a beam had caught it, and utterly, immovably in their way. The first came at him with a short energy blade, confident in the assumption that a man who'd just taken that kind of structural hit couldn't have much fight left. Kellen let him get close enough to commit to the strike, then used the man's own forward momentum against him, a technique Wren had drilled into him a dozen times in the training hall, and turned the blade's line just enough that it opened a shallow gash along his ribs instead of finding anything vital, while his good arm drove an elbow into the attacker's throat hard enough to drop him choking to the dais floor. The second hesitated just a half-second, just long enough to register that the first one was down, and the human protector was still on his feet despite everything. And that half-second was enough for Wren's blade guard, finally cutting through the panicked crowd, to reach the dais and close the gap. The second attacker took one look at the wall of trained blades bearing down on him from Wren's detachment, and the immovable, blood-soaked human still standing over the queen, and made the same calculation the terrorist assassin had made weeks before. He dropped his weapon and put both hands up. The third didn't wait to see how the second surrender was received. He turned and ran, vanishing back into the chaos of the collapsing hall before Wren's people could close on him, and would not be found. Not that day, not in the weeks of investigation that followed, though the trail of the device's components would eventually, inevitably, wind its way back toward a supply contract quietly routed through a shell company registered, once again, in territory under the Marshal's fleet jurisdiction. But by then Kellen was no longer standing. The moment the second attacker's weapon hit the floor, the moment the adrenaline that had been the only thing holding him upright finally ran out, his legs simply stopped answering him, and he went down hard onto the dust-covered dais, dimly aware of Elira's hands catching at his shoulders, of her voice saying his name in a register he had never heard from her before, not the composed authority of a queen, not even the careful warmth of the woman who'd thanked him twice for his honesty. But something rower than either, something that sounded to his fading awareness uncomfortably close to fear. "Stay with me," she was saying, her hands pressed hard against the worst of the bleeding along his ribs, her face inches from his, dust-streaked and tear-bright in a way he would remember clearly even through the gray closing in at the edges of his vision. "Kellen, stay with me. That is an order from your queen, do you understand me? That is an order." Wasn't planning, he managed, on going anywhere. It was, he would think later, a stupid thing to say while bleeding out on a dais with a broken arm and possibly a punctured lung. But it made her laugh, a short, wrecked, disbelieving sound with tears running through it, and that was the last thing he was fully aware of before the gray finally won and the world went dark. He woke 3 days later in the palace infirmary, ribs bound, arm set and splinted, a dull ache radiating from a dozen places at once, and the first thing he registered, before the pain, before the sterile smell of the room, was Elira asleep in a chair pulled close to the bed, still in the same travel-worn clothes from Havenmere, her hand resting on the edge of the mattress inches from his. He didn't move for a long moment, just watched her, the exhaustion carved into her face even in sleep, the dry dust still caught along her hairline that no one had apparently convinced her to wash out before she'd sat down to wait, and felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with the broken ribs. She woke when he shifted, startling upright with the particular speed of someone who'd fallen asleep against their will rather than by choice. "You're awake." Apparently, his voice came out rough. "How long was I out?" 3 days. The physicians say you should have been out for 5, given the extent of it. They also say you have the constitution of a man, twice your training, and no sense at all for when to stop taking hits meant for other people. Her hand had not moved from the mattress, and now, deliberately, she let it close over his. "You collapsed a section of Havenmere's ceiling on your back, Kellen. You should have died. I watched you almost die, holding your own blood in with my hands, and there was nothing in 8 years of ruling that prepared me for how that felt." "Sorry," he said, and meant it, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for. "Don't be sorry, be alive. That is the only apology I require." Her thumb moved once absently across his knuckles, and then, as if only just now permitting herself to say it, she added, quieter, "I have had 2 other protectors die keeping me safe in 8 years. I mourned them both properly, and I meant it both times, and I have never once in either case felt what I felt watching you go down on that dais. I do not entirely know what to do with that, Protector Voss." "You don't have to do anything with it," Kellen said. "Not right now. I'm not going anywhere, remember. Gave you my word on a courtyard floor and again on a collapsing dais. Figure that ought to count for something." "It counts for a great deal," she said, and for a moment neither of them said anything further, the quiet in the infirmary room settling around them both like something neither wanted to disturb. It was Wren who broke it, arriving with the investigation's findings in hand, and a grimness in his expression that told Kellen, even through the fog of painkillers, that whatever the old commander had learned in the last 3 days was worse than a collapsed ceiling and a fled assassin. "The device," Wren said without preamble, once he'd confirmed Kellen was lucid enough to understand him, "was not a single act. Havenmere's structural engineers have finished their survey. 4 other load points in that hall were rigged the same way, dormant, unfired, designed to bring down the entire structure if the first charge had not achieved its goal. This was not an assassination attempt aimed only at the Queen, Voss. It was aimed at removing the entire tariff delegation in one act, 3 dominions worth of leadership in a single collapsed hall, in a way that could be blamed on structural failure and old construction, rather than on any single actor. That's not Dreeth trying to kill one queen anymore, Kellen said slowly, understanding arriving through the ache in his ribs. That's Dreeth trying to create a power vacuum big enough to walk into. Precisely, Wren's jaw was tight. We have found records, fragmentary, deniable, but consistent, suggesting the Marshal has spent the last 2 years quietly consolidating loyalty within 3 of the border fleets under pretense of routine command rotations. Enough ships, enough soldiers, that if the summit delegation had died and the succession crisis that followed had been chaotic enough, he could have proposed himself as the only stabilizing authority remaining, backed by force sufficient to make refusal costly. He wanted a war he could end, Elira said quietly, so that he could be the one who ended it and rule what was left. That is my reading, yes. Wren looked between them both. The trial of Worth was never truly about testing Voss's fitness, majesty. It was a delay, a chance to remove him through legitimate means before Havenmere, so that whatever happened there would happen with a properly caste-approved protector standing beside you, one whose loyalty the Marshal had reason to believe he could eventually purchase or intimidate. When the trial failed, Havenmere became the fallback. When Havenmere failed, "He'll try again," Kellen said. "Bigger, because he's already shown us he doesn't stop recalibrating just because a plan fails. He just builds the next one on what he learned from the last." "Yes," Wren said grimly. "And we are running out of time to stop him choosing the venue for the next attempt, because there is one event remaining on the calendar large enough, and public enough, and unavoidable enough, that he cannot simply wait for another opportunity to manufacture. It is coming in 3 weeks, whether we are ready or not." Elira's hand tightened around Kellen's. "The Ascension coronation," she said, "the formal seating. Every house, every fleet commander, every foreign delegation still speaking to the Dominion after Havenmere, all gathered in one hall, on one day, to watch my rule formally confirmed for a second decade. An event," Wren said, "that the Marshal, as ranking military authority beneath the throne, is by tradition responsible for securing." The silence that followed that statement said everything the three of them needed to say about how thin their remaining options actually were. They spent the following 3 weeks preparing for a fight none of them could openly call a fight, because accusing Dreeth outright, without proof that would hold before the full assembled houses, risked exactly the chaos and legitimacy crisis he was trying to manufacture anyway, only sooner and on his terms rather than theirs. Wren quietly rotated Blade Guard, loyalty tested over the preceding decade, into every checkpoint along the coronation route, replacing units whose commanders had come up through Dreeth's fleet postings. Elira, working with what Kellen recognized as the same careful, patient calculation she brought to every council session, began cultivating quiet alliances among the border house lords who'd watched Havenmere's collapse and understood, even without proof, that something beyond bad luck had been at work there. Enough of them, by the 3rd week, that a formal accusation when the moment came would not stand alone. Kellen spent the 3 weeks doing what he did best, reading the coronation hall for weak seams, the way he'd read the Havenmere hall too late to stop the first attack, determined not to make the same mistake twice. He walked the route a dozen times. He mapped every entrance, every rooftop sightline, every service corridor that hadn't seen use in a decade and might therefore have gone unwatched. He argued, successfully, for 3 structural reinforcements to load-bearing points he didn't trust, over the objections of household engineers who found it faintly absurd that a dockworker was correcting their certifications, until Wren backed him without qualification, and the objections stopped. He also spent those 3 weeks healing, slower than he liked, faster than the physicians expected, the cracked ribs knitting and the arm coming out of its splint 2 days ahead of schedule, because he'd been quietly working the joint through range-of-motion exercises against direct medical advice, unwilling to walk into whatever was coming still favoring an arm. And he spent them in the evenings, in Elira's company more often than either of them formally acknowledged, not as protector and queen exactly, in those quiet hours, but as 2 people who had nearly watched each other die and had decided, without ever quite saying so aloud, that they intended to keep choosing each other for as long as they were both still standing to do it. "My mother told me once," Elira said, one such evening, the 2 of them on the same terrace where the first assassin's blade had touched her throat, now lit gold with the last of the evening sun, that a monarch who lets herself need one person too much has handed her enemies a single target instead of a throne to attack. She meant it as a warning. I have thought of it as one for 8 years, every time a courtier or a foreign prince suggested I ought to marry for the Dominion's stability rather than my own preference. I have always agreed with her, in principle. And now I have watched a man take a ceiling meant for me onto his own back without hesitating long enough to calculate whether it was wise," she said. "And I find I am considerably less interested in my mother's warning than I once was, however sound the logic behind it." She looked at him directly, the gold light catching the pale violet of her eyes. "I am not asking you anything tonight, Kellen Voss. I am aware there is a coronation in 11 days that may try to kill us both, and I do not intend to complicate that with a conversation neither of us has time to finish properly. But I wanted you to know, before that day comes, whatever it brings, that my mother was right about the danger of it, and I have decided the danger is worth carrying anyway." Kellen didn't have an answer polished enough for a queen's confession, so he gave her the only one he had. "6 months ago, I pulled a stranger out from under a collapsed pier and didn't think about her again until she stood on a throne dais, and said my name in front of 200 people who wanted to hear anyone else's, he said. I've had a lot of time since then to think about why that stuck with me the way it did. I don't have a court-trained way of saying it, but I'd rather stand next to you through whatever's coming in 11 days than be anywhere safer without you. That's not duty talking anymore, hasn't been for a while. She didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. She reached over and took his hand again, the same gesture as the infirmary, and they sat together on the terrace until the gold light faded fully into dusk, both of them quietly aware that whatever peace this was, it was borrowed time, and that the 11 days remaining before the coronation would decide whether they got to keep it. 4 days before the coronation, Wren's people took the fled Havenmere assassin alive. He had gone to ground in a border world safe house Wren's investigators had been quietly watching since the Shell Company trail first led there, and he did not hold out long under questioning once he understood the alternative Wren offered him: a full confession in exchange for his life, rather than a quiet execution that would leave his employer entirely untouched. What he gave them, over 6 hours in a windowless room beneath the palace, confirmed everything Wren had feared and added a detail that turned Kellen's blood cold. The marshal's plan for the coronation was not another external strike. It could not be. Every entrance, every rooftop, every service corridor had been reinforced or watched since Havenmere, and Dreeth, whatever else he was not a man who repeated a failed approach twice. Instead, he had spent 18 months quietly cultivating a single asset inside the Blade Guard itself, a mid-ranking commander named Vesic, third in seniority beneath Wren, whose gambling debts and resentment at being passed over for promotion twice in favor of younger officers had made him, in the assassin's blunt phrasing, already halfway sold before the marshal ever made the first offer. Vesic's role on the day of the coronation would be simple and catastrophic. He commanded the honor detachment responsible for the ceremonial weapons check at the hall's main entrance, the single checkpoint through which every attending house's personal guard would pass their blades for ritual inspection and sealing before entering the coronation hall unarmed, a tradition dating back centuries, meant to guarantee that no delegation could bring a weapon into the Queen's presence. Vesic's detachment would perform the check publicly, correctly, in front of witnesses, and then quietly fail to seal roughly 30 of the blades belonging to a specific block of border house guards secretly loyal to the marshal, leaving them live and accessible the moment the ceremony reached its climax and every eye in the hall was fixed on the Queen. 30 armed men, already inside the hall, already trusted, already standing among the crowd rather than storming a gate, and Dreeth's own fleet units, quietly repositioned over the preceding weeks under the cover of routine coronation security rotations, close enough to the palace grounds to move in and restore order, within minutes of the chaos beginning, exactly as Havenmere had been designed to let him do on a larger scale. He learned from the trial, Kellen said, once the confession had been laid out fully before Elira, Wren, and the small circle of border house lords Elira had spent 3 weeks quietly bringing into her confidence. He learned I can't be beaten one-on-one anymore, not easily, not without exposing himself doing it. So this time it's not about beating me. It's about making sure there are 30 of them, and one of me, in a room full of people who won't be able to tell friend from enemy until the first blade's already out. Then we do not let it become 30 against 1, Wren said. We know Vesic's name now. We know which blades he intends to leave live. We can remove him from his post before the ceremony ever begins, seal every blade properly under a commander we trust completely, and the marshal's entire plan collapses before it starts. No, Elira said, and both men turned to her. If we quietly remove Vesic now, Dreeth learns within the hour that his plan is compromised, and a man that patient does not simply give up. He adapts again, finds some third approach we have not anticipated, on a timeline we no longer control. I have spent 8 years watching him build contingencies inside contingencies. I do not intend to spend another 8 years waiting for whichever one he builds next. Majesty, Ren said carefully, what are you proposing? I am proposing we let him believe his plan is working, Elira said, right up until the moment it fails in front of every house, every fleet commander, and every foreign delegation still watching this dominion to see whether my throne can survive its own military authority turning against it. I want him exposed publicly, decisively, with proof the entire assembly can see with their own eyes, not quietly arrested in a back corridor where he can later claim persecution by a queen too insecure to face him openly. If we are going to end this, Commander, I want it ended in the same hall he chose to try to end me. Kellen felt something cold settle in his chest at that, not fear for himself exactly, but the particular dread of watching someone he'd come to love choose the harder, more dangerous path, because it was also the right one. That means letting 30 armed men into a room with you, he said, and trusting that I can hold the line until Ren's people can move. It means trusting you, Elira said, meeting his eyes steadily, because I have watched you do exactly that twice now when the odds were worse and the warning shorter. I am not asking you to do it alone, Kellen. I am asking you to do it as the point of a plan the rest of us are going to build carefully enough that you should not have to. The plan they built over the following 3 days was as careful as Elira had promised. Vesic would keep his post, unaware his treachery had been discovered, sealing the blades exactly as Dreeth had instructed him. Because Ren's people had, in the intervening hours, quietly and undetectably swapped every blade in the compromised block's arsenal for training weapons, dulled and structurally weakened, identical in appearance to the real thing down to the house markings etched into each hilt. A substitution performed, while the weapons sat overnight in the honor guard's own armory under a maintenance pretext, no one thought twice about. The 30 men would draw blades they believed were live and lethal. They would not be. Ren's loyal blade guard, meanwhile, would be positioned throughout the hall not as an obvious wall of visible security. Dreeth would read a heavy guard presence instantly and adapt again, but dispersed among the attending house's own retinues, in household colors rather than blade guard uniform, close enough to close on any point of the hall within seconds, invisible until the moment they needed to stop being invisible. And Dreeth's repositioned fleet units, the ones meant to sweep in and restore order, once the chaos began, would find their approach vectors to the palace grounds quietly, deniably obstructed by 3 border house fleets, whose lords Elira had spent 3 weeks convincing, with proof of the Shell Company trail and the Havenmere structural survey, that their own future safety depended on the Marshal never getting the chance to consolidate the power a successful coup would hand him. Which left Kellen with the one role no substitution or reinforcement could fill. Standing at Elira's shoulder in the moment, the crowd's confidence in dulled blades collided with 30 men's confidence that their weapons were live. In the half-second gap before anyone else in that hall would understand what was happening at all. You understand, Ren told him, the night before the coronation, both of them alone in the training chamber where this had all begun 3 months earlier, that even with dulled blades, 30 desperate men in close quarters can still kill with their bare hands, or improvise, or simply overwhelm through numbers before my people can reach you. This is not a guarantee of safety. It is a plan to make the odds survivable, not to make them fair. I know, Kellen said. Then why do you not look more afraid? Kellen thought about the question honestly before answering it. Because I've had 3 months to figure out what I actually am standing next to her, he said. Turns out it isn't a dockworker who got lucky once. It's a man who decided, a long time before he ever met her, that some things are worth standing in front of even when the math says you shouldn't. Ren, I appreciate everything you've taught me these 3 months. I mean that. But that part of it, I already had before I ever walked into that training hall the first day. You just gave me the tools to make account for something. Ren studied him for a long moment, and then did something Kellen hadn't expected. He extended a hand. Not the formal court gesture Kellen had learned over 3 months of household protocol, but a plain, direct clasp, soldier to soldier. "Then tomorrow," Wren said, "you will not be standing there as a laborer the court tested and grudgingly accepted. You will be standing there as the finest protector this dominion has bonded in 3 generations, and I will make certain every house in that hall understands it by the time the sun sets. Whatever else happens tomorrow, Voss, that much is already true, and no blade, live or dulled, is going to change it." Kellen did not go back to his rooms that night. He went instead, with Wren's grudging blessing and 2 quiet plainclothes escorts trailing at a respectful distance, down into the ferry quarter one last time before the ceremony that might decide, one way or another, whether he ever walked its streets again. He found Dissas still at the Union Hall past the dinner bell, going over the depot's maintenance schedules with the same stubborn thoroughness she'd brought to the job for 15 years. And she looked up when he came through the door with an expression that told him she'd already heard, through whatever channels moved information faster through the quarter than any official notice ever could, exactly what tomorrow was likely to bring. "You didn't have to come down here tonight of all nights," she said, setting the schedules aside. "Figured if tomorrow goes badly," Kellen said, "I'd rather it not be the last thing I did before it. Wanted to see the place standing on its own 2 feet one more time is all, not as anybody's protector, just as somebody who used to fix the coolant lines on Pier 9. Dissas studied him for a long moment, the particular assessing look of a woman who had spent a career reading exhausted men, and knowing which ones needed to be talked out of something, and which ones just needed to be let alone. "You're not fixing coolant lines anymore, Voss," she said finally, gentler than her usual bluntness. "Whatever happens tomorrow, that part's done. But for what it's worth, the whole quarter knows what you did for that clerk they used to sneer at behind his back, and what you did getting that reclamation system funded, and every one of them's going to be standing outside a public viewing screen tomorrow watching that ceremony like it's their own family up on that dais. Because it is, near enough. You didn't leave us, Voss. You just found a bigger stretch of pier to hold up." Word had already spread through the Union Hall by the time he stepped back out into the evening street, and by the time he'd walked 2 blocks toward the old flat he still technically held the lease on. A small crowd had gathered, not a mob, nothing that alarmed his escorts, just neighbors and coworkers drifting out of doorways and workshop fronts the way people do, when word moves faster than any of them could name where it started, wanting, plainly, just to see him for a moment before tomorrow. A girl of perhaps 7, the daughter of a rigger Kellen had worked beside for 6 years, broke from her mother's hand and ran the last few steps toward him before anyone could stop her, small and fierce, and entirely unbothered by the 2 escorts who tensed at the sudden movement. "Are you really going to be the Queen's husband?" she demanded, tipping her head all the way back to look up at him, breathless from the run. "Mama said there's a big ceremony tomorrow and everybody's watching, and you're going to stand up in front of the whole sky, and she's going to say you're hers." "Something like that," Kellen said, crouching down to her level, ignoring the faint, indulgent laughter rippling through the small, gathered crowd behind her. "Not quite a husband. Something the Virans have an older word for, but close enough, I figure." "My mama says you used to fix the pipes right here," the girl said, pointing down the street toward the old maintenance shed. "And now you're going to be practically a king, and she says that means anybody can be anything. And I told her that's silly because I already knew you were important, because you always said hello to me even when you were carrying the heavy tools and looked tired." Kellen felt something catch in his chest that had nothing to do with the coronation waiting for him tomorrow, and everything to do with a small, plain truth a 7-year-old had just handed him without any idea how much weight it carried. "That's it exactly," he said. "That's the whole thing, actually. Doesn't matter what they end up calling me tomorrow. I'm still going to say hello to you when I see you, heavy tools or not." The girl beamed, satisfied, and let her mother draw her back with an apologetic look toward Kellen's escorts, and the small crowd began to disperse, back into doorways and workshop fronts, murmured well wishes trailing after him as he walked the last stretch back toward the palace transport waiting at the quarter's edge. He thought about the girl's question the whole ride back, turning it over the way he'd once turned over a strained pipe joint, looking for where the real weight sat. Not a husband, not quite, not by whatever formal word the recognition right would eventually use. But close enough, he decided, that the distinction didn't much matter to a 7-year-old, and didn't, on reflection, much matter to him either. Elira was waiting when he returned, in the private study rather than her chambers, still dressed for the day's business though the hour had grown late, and she looked up from whatever report she'd been pretending to read when he came through the door. "Wren told me where you'd gone," she said. "I did not stop him from telling you it was permitted, though I confess I spent the last 2 hours more anxious about it than I let the guards see." "Had to say goodbye to the pipes," Kellen said, "in case tomorrow goes sideways. Also had a very direct 7-year-old inform me I'm about to become practically a king, and correct her mother's theory about it, meaning anybody can be anything, on the grounds that she already knew I was important because I said hello to her carrying heavy tools." Elira's tired expression cracked into something warmer at that, the same almost smile from the very first week, and for a moment the weight of the ceremony waiting for them both in the morning receded just slightly, crowded out by something smaller and more ordinary and, in its own way, more important. "She sounds considerably wiser than most of my council," she said. "She's not wrong either," Kellen said, crossing the room to stand beside her chair. "Doesn't matter what happens tomorrow, what they call me, whether the whole thing goes exactly to plan or every part of Wren's careful math falls apart in the first 10 seconds. I already said hello to that girl carrying heavy tools 100 times before any of this started, and I'll keep doing it after, one way or another. Whatever's decided in that hall tomorrow, it's not deciding who I already am. Just what the rest of the Dominion's finally going to call it out loud." Elira reached up and took his hand, the same gesture she'd returned to 100 times in the year that followed, and for a long moment neither of them said anything further, the study's lamp burning low around them, both of them quietly gathering whatever steadiness they could before the morning arrived and asked everything of them at once. The morning of the coronation dawned bright and cold over Versi, the coronation hall's tall windows catching the early light in long gold bars across the mosaic floor, 200 nobles and foreign delegates filing in over the course of 2 hours in ceremonial dress that turned the whole vast chamber into a slow-moving river of silk and polished armor, and Kellen stood at Elira's shoulder in the antechamber just before the doors opened, watching her steady her breathing the way he'd learned, in 3 months, that she did before every moment that mattered. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, "I'm not leaving your side. Not for 30 men, not for Dreeth's whole fleet, not for anything." "I know," Elira said, and reached over to take his hand one last time before the doors swung open on the ceremony that would decide, one way or another, whether either of them lived to see what came after it. "That is precisely why I am not afraid, Kellen Voss. Now let us go finish what he started." The ascension ceremony moved through its first 2 hours exactly as 3 centuries of tradition dictated. The recitation of the Dominion's founding charter, the presentation of each house's formal allegiance, the slow procession of tribute from the border worlds and the trade consortiums, all of it unfolding under the coronation hall's vaulted ceiling in a rhythm so old and so precise that Kellen, standing at Elira's shoulder through the whole of it, found himself grateful for every hour Wren had spent walking him through the choreography beforehand. He knew exactly where each house stood in the hall. He knew exactly where Vesik's honor detachment held their post along the north wall, 30 sealed blades resting in their sheaths, every one of them dulled and weakened and utterly unaware of it. He knew exactly where Wren's dispersed people waited in household colors among the crowd, and exactly where Dreith stood, near the dais' eastern edge, in the ceremonial armor of the Dominion's regent marshal, watching the proceedings with an expression of composed, patient satisfaction that told Kellen the man believed completely that he had already won. The moment came, as Wren had predicted it would at the ceremony's climax, the formal seating, when Elira would rise from the lesser throne she'd occupied through the preliminary rites and take the Dominion's true seat, the ancient carved chair that only a confirmed monarch was permitted to touch, the single moment in the entire ceremony when every eye in the hall, by centuries of tradition and simple human curiosity both, would be fixed on the throne and nowhere else. Elira rose. The hall's herald began the confirmation invocation, his voice carrying up into the vaulted stone, and Kellen watched from the corner of his eye Vesik's hand move, a small, precise gesture toward his own honor guard, the signal Dreith's plan had been built around. 30 blades came out of 30 sheaths in the same instant, a sound like a held breath finally released, and the hall's slow ceremonial rhythm shattered into chaos in under 2 seconds. Nobles scattered from the north wall's sudden violence. Foreign delegates who had no idea what was happening threw themselves toward the exits. And 30 men who had been told and believed that they carried live steel converged toward the dais with the confidence of soldiers, certain their weapons could do exactly what weapons were supposed to do. Kellen was already moving, already between them and Elira, already close enough to the first attacker to see the exact moment the man's blade, swung with full committed force, aimed to open Kellen's throat, met flesh, and did not cut. The dulled edge skated across Kellen's raised forearm instead, leaving an ugly bruise and a thin line of broken skin where a live blade would have taken the arm off at the elbow, and the attacker's face went slack with confusion in the half-second it took him to understand that his weapon had failed him. Kellen didn't give him a second half-second. He drove a fist into the man's jaw, dropped him, and turned to the next. All across the hall, the same confusion was rippling outward through Vesik's compromised block, blades that should have opened wounds instead bouncing off armor, off raised arms, off household guards who'd been told, in the final hours before the ceremony, exactly what to expect and had positioned themselves accordingly. What should have been a massacre in the first 30 seconds became, instead, a brawl the loyal side was already winning before most of the hall had even finished processing that an attack was underway at all. But confusion, Kellen understood even as he fought through it, was not the same as defeat, and 30 desperate men who realized their blades had been sabotaged did not simply surrender. Some of them, the ones closest to the dais, abandoned their useless steel entirely and came at him bare-handed, or grabbed at whatever improvised weapon the ceremony's furnishings offered, a broken ceremonial standard, a heavy processional urn, anything that could still do damage without an edge. He fought 3 of them at once near the dais steps, taking a hit across the ribs that reopened the half-healed damage from Havenmere, taking a graze along his jaw from a swung standard pole, and putting all 3 down inside a minute through a combination of Wren's 3 months of training and 11 years of fairy quarter, instinct that no formal Blade Guard curriculum had ever needed to teach. Because no Blade Guard candidate had ever grown up breaking up dock brawls with nothing but a pipe wrench, and the certainty that someone smaller than him was counting on it ending fast. Wren's people, meanwhile, were closing on the rest of Vesik's detachment with brutal, disciplined speed, live blades against dulled ones turning the fight decisively in seconds rather than minutes, and within 90 seconds of the first blade clearing its sheath, more than half of the 30 were down, disarmed, or fled toward exits that Wren's advanced planning had already quietly sealed. That left perhaps a dozen still fighting when the hall's great doors at the far end burst open, and a second wave surged through, not household guards this time, but the cindered chain proper. A dozen professional operatives in matte black wrap armor Kellen recognized instantly from the terrace attack 3 months before, sent. He understood in the half-second he had to process it. as Dreeth's final contingency in case the honor guard plan somehow failed. Held in reserve outside the hall and committed the moment the alarm went up inside. Their leader was a tall figure moving with a fluid, economical grace that told Kellen, at a glance, this was someone who had survived professions of violence for a very long time, and who was walking straight toward the dais with the specific, focused intent of a man who had been paid, and paid well, to finish what 30 compromised amateurs had failed to. Wren's forces, still finishing off the last of Vesic's men, were a full room's length away. Elira stood on the dais behind Kellen, close enough that he could hear her breathing, refusing. He registered this even through the chaos, with a fierce, sudden pride, to run or hide behind the throne the way protocol and simple sense would have permitted her to, standing her ground because she had told him days ago that she did not intend to let this be decided anywhere but where it started. The chain leader closed the distance in seconds, live blade already drawn, and Kellen put himself squarely in the man's path, blood running from 3 separate wounds, ribs screaming, arms leaden with 3 minutes of continuous fighting, and did not step back. "You're the last piece," Kellen said, buying himself the half-second it took to read the man's stance, the way he shifted his weight forward onto the balls of his feet, the particular economy of a fighter who did not waste motion. Dreeth's insurance policy in case the rest of it failed. "I am the part of the plan that does not fail," the leader said, voice flat behind the wrap mask, and came in fast, blade aimed low and rising. A killing angle. Kellen barely turned aside in time, taking a 4th cut along his forearm for the privilege. They traded 3 more exchanges in as many seconds, Kellen giving ground now, genuinely outmatched by a professional's speed and precision in a way none of the amateurs before him had come close to, and understood, with the same flat clarity that had gotten him through 2 tours and out the other side, that he was losing this particular fight on pure skill, and that the only thing standing between this blade and Elira was how much longer his body could keep absorbing damage before it simply stopped answering him. He took the next cut on purpose, let the blade open a line across his upper arm rather than dodge fully clear, because dodging fully clear would have opened space between himself and the dais that the leader could exploit, and used the half-second the man spent expecting him to fold from the pain, the same trick that had ended the trial against Korash, to close the distance instead of retreating from it. Driving forward inside the blade's reach, and slamming his forehead into the bridge of the man's nose, with everything he had left. It should not have been enough against someone this skilled. It very nearly wasn't. The leader staggered but did not go down, blood streaming from his ruined nose, blade coming back up in a wild, furious arc that Kellen barely got his forearm under, feeling the impact jar all the way to his shoulder. And then Elira's voice cut across the chaos, sharp and absolute, carrying the full weight of 8 years of command behind it. "Look at him," she said, not to Kellen, to the leader, to the handful of chain operatives still standing, to every remaining fighter in that hall who had a moment left to hear her. "Look at what you are still fighting. 3 months ago, 4 of your own crew put a blade to my throat and dropped it within 90 seconds because something about one unarmed man convinced them the contract could not be won. You have watched him take a trial champion down in 4 minutes with no formal training. You have watched him take a collapsing ceiling on his own back rather than let it touch me. You have watched him stand here, bleeding from 4 wounds, and not take 1 step back in 3 straight minutes of a fight that would have broken any 3 of you individually. I am not asking you to surrender out of loyalty to my throne. I am asking you to do the arithmetic your own guild has clearly already started, because 4 of your brothers did it on a terrace 3 months ago, and every one of you standing here right now can see exactly why they were right too." The leader's blade wavered, not dropped, not yet, but wavered, the fight's momentum breaking for just a fraction of a second as her words landed on a room already 3 minutes deep into watching one man refuse to fall. That fraction of a second was all Ren needed. His people, finally clear of Vesek's last men, hit the remaining chain operatives from behind in a coordinated wall of live steel, and the fight that had held the hall in chaos for barely 4 minutes total began, all at once, to end. The leader turned, saw Ren's forces closing from 3 sides, saw the rest of his crew already down or disarmed, saw the bleeding, immovable human still standing between him and the throne despite every wound he'd taken, and made the same calculation the terrorist assassin had made 3 months before, only now with an entire hall of witnesses watching him make it. He let the blade fall from his hand. It rang against the mosaic floor, loud in the sudden, ragged quiet that followed, and one by one, around the hall, the last handful of still-fighting operatives did the same, weapons clattering to the stone, hands raising, 3 months of accumulated failure finally arriving at its inevitable conclusion in front of the full assembled Dominion. Minutes. That was all it had taken, start to finish. The same word Elira had used on the terrace 3 months before, the same recognition arriving now on a far larger stage, in front of every house and every foreign delegation that would carry the story of what they'd just witnessed back to 100 worlds. Kellen went down to one knee then, not from a killing blow but from simple exhaustion, 4 wounds bleeding freely, his body finally announcing that it had given everything it had left to give. Elira was at his side before he'd fully registered falling, her hands finding the worst of his wounds with the same fierce, unsteady urgency as Havenmere, and behind her, across the hall, he heard Ren's voice rising in fury and command as the old commander's people converged on the one man in that entire chaos who had not lifted a weapon at all through the whole of it, Regent Marshal Dreeth Corving, standing motionless near the dais' eastern edge, his composed satisfaction finally visibly cracking as he understood, watching his last contingency surrender in real time, that there was no 4th plan left to fall back on. "Take him," Elira said, not looking away from Kellen's wounds even as she said it, her voice carrying the full weight of a throne now unambiguously, publicly hers. "Take the marshal into custody, and every officer who took Vesek's coin alongside him. This ends today, in this hall, in front of every witness who will ever need to be told it ended." Dreeth did not run. Kellen would give him that much, watching through the gray edges of his own vision as Ren's guards closed on him. The man stood still and let himself be taken, his face gone finally, fully unreadable in a way that told Kellen the calculation behind it had simply run out of moves to make. "You built this on the assumption that I would not survive to see it," Kellen managed, as Ren's people led Dreeth past the dais steps. 3 months, and every plan came down to the same math. You were never wrong that the odds favored you. You were only ever wrong about what she'd chosen when she named me. Dreeth looked at him for a long moment, bleeding, exhausted, still on one knee, still, somehow, the reason every one of his plans had failed, and said nothing at all, which was, Kellen thought distantly as the gray finally closed in a second time, the most honest answer the man had given anyone in 3 months. He woke the second time in the same infirmary bed, sunlight further along the wall than he remembered it being before, and understood from the ache settled deep into every part of him that considerably more than a few hours had passed. Elira was there again, awake this time, sitting straighter than exhaustion should have allowed, a stack of formal documents balanced on her knee that she set aside the instant his eyes opened. 2 days this time, she said, before he could ask. The physicians are beginning to suspect you simply enjoy the company in here. Company's not bad, Kellen said. His voice came out steadier than the last time. Dreeth. In a secure holding cell 3 levels below the palace, awaiting formal judgment before the full assembly of houses, Elira said. He has said almost nothing since the coronation hall. His silence, I am told by those questioning him, is its own kind of confession, A man who spent decades building contingencies has apparently not built one for simply being caught in full view, with no plausible deniability left to retreat behind. She paused. Vesic has been more forthcoming. He gave us everything within a day, every shell company, every falsified fleet rotation, 2 years of correspondence he'd been foolish enough to keep partial records of, believing, I suspect, that he might need leverage over the marshal eventually rather than the reverse. It is more than enough. The houses that stood with us at Havenmere and the coronation both have already begun circulating a formal charge of treason against the crown. There is very little room left for him to maneuver, even for a man who has spent a lifetime finding room where none should exist. And you, the Dominion. Shaken, she admitted. Frightened in places by how close it came to succeeding, and angry, genuinely angry, in a way I have not seen from this court in years, that a man they trusted with their border fleets spent 2 years quietly preparing to burn the whole Dominion down rather than watch a queen he considered beneath his notice keep ruling it. There will be difficult months ahead untangling how deep his network reached. But the assembly that watched you hold that hall for 4 minutes against 30-odd men and a professional killer, and watched them lay down their weapons one by one rather than keep fighting a losing contract, that assembly is not asking anymore whether the throne made the right choice naming you. She reached over, closed her hand around his. They are asking how quickly they can stop being embarrassed they ever doubted it. Kellen let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though it pulled at the bandaging across his ribs enough that he regretted it immediately. Wren's going to be insufferable about being right. Commander Wren, Elira said dryly, has already informed the full council twice that he identified your particular quality of resolve within your first training session, and that the rest of us simply required 4 months and a coronation hall full of drawn blades to catch up to his assessment. I expect he will remind everyone of this for the remainder of his career. The weeks that followed moved slower than the 4 minutes in the coronation hall had, but they moved with a weight and a consequence Kellen hadn't fully anticipated when he'd first accepted a summons meant, he'd assumed, to discuss a peer accident. Dreith's formal trial before the assembled houses took 11 days, laid out in exhaustive, damning detail by investigators who no longer had to work 3 walls deep to prove what everyone in that hall had already watched happen in front of them. The shell companies, the redirected fleet loyalties, the 2-year cultivation of a compromised Bladeguard commander, the Havenmere device components traced conclusively, at last, to a procurement contract bearing the marshal's own seal. He did not deny any of it in the end. He simply stood, when the verdict was read, with the same composed stillness he had carried through every council session Kellen had ever watched him attend, and accepted a sentence of permanent exile to a border penal world, stripped of rank, title, and fleet command, his household holdings dissolved and redistributed among the houses that had stood loyal through the worst of it. Kellen attended every day of the 11, standing at Elira's shoulder through testimony that grew more damning by the hour, and found himself, on the final day, watching Dreith rather than the evidence being read against him. Waiting, he realized only as it happened, for some flicker of the man who had once called his own defeat at the trial a mistake in the throne's arithmetic, some last attempt to reframe the wreckage as anything other than what it plainly was. It never came. When the marshal of the proceedings asked, as protocol required, whether the accused wished to speak before sentencing, Dreith was silent for so long that the hall itself seemed to hold its breath waiting on him. I built this Dominion's border fleets from nothing twice across 2 different wars, he said finally, his voice carrying none of its old courtroom polish, worn thin in a way Kellen had never once heard from him across 4 months of careful public composure. I watched 3 monarchs rule this throne in my lifetime, and I judged each of them by the same measure, whether they understood that strength, not sentiment, was the only currency our enemies ever respected. I misjudged this queen's strength for softness because she chose to test it through a rescue on a collapsed pier rather than a show of force on a parade ground, and I have spent 4 months discovering, at considerable cost to everyone in this hall, exactly how badly I misjudged it." He looked, for the first time in the entire proceeding, directly at Elira rather than past her. "I do not ask for mercy, Majesty. I ask only that the record reflect I was wrong about the man, and wrong about you, and that both errors were mine alone to make. Whatever exile you set for me, I will not pretend it is undeserved." It was not an apology, not precisely, and Kellen understood, watching Elira's expression remain carefully composed through it, that she heard it the same way he did, less a plea for forgiveness than a proud man's final, grudging concession that the arithmetic had never once favored the side he'd chosen. She did not answer him directly. She simply nodded once, let the marshal read the sentence, and the hall's business concluded with none of the drama 4 months of scheming had built toward, only the quiet, procedural finality of a man's ambitions being formally, permanently closed out. Wren, standing near enough to Kellen to be heard only by him, let out a slow breath once the sentence had been formally recorded. 30 years I served beneath that man's fleet authority," the old commander said quietly, "and I never once heard him speak that plainly about anything, victory or defeat both. I do not know whether to call it the most honest thing he has ever said in this palace, or the last performance of a man who has simply run out of better ones to give." He shook his head, some old weight visibly settling off his shoulders now that the proceeding had finally closed. "Either way, Voss, it is finished, and I find I have very little appetite left for wondering which it was. There is a dominion that still needs governing, and a queen who has spent 4 months proving she can do it without needing 11 days of a trial to remind anyone why." "Copy that," Kellen said, and Wren huffed something that was almost a laugh at the borrowed core phrase, the two of them falling into step behind Elira as the hall began, finally, to empty. "Do you believe him?" Kellen asked her afterward, the two of them alone in the corridor outside the emptied hall. "That he was wrong about the man and not just wrong about winning?" "I believe he finally understood the difference between the two, somewhere in these 11 days, and that understanding it 4 months too late is its own kind of punishment for a man who prided himself on never being late to anything," Elira said. "Whether that makes him less dangerous or simply more honest about the danger he already was, I do not think I will ever fully know. I find, strangely, that I no longer need to know it. He is gone from this hall and this throne, and I intend to spend considerably less of my remaining years thinking about him than I have spent these last 4 months." "You could have asked for his death," Kellen said to Elira, the evening after the sentence was passed, the two of them walking the palace gardens in the cooling dusk, his arms still in a light brace, his stride still careful over the healing ribs. Nobody in that assembly would have questioned it. "I considered it," Elira admitted, "for longer than I am entirely proud of. But my mother taught me one other thing, alongside the warning about needing one person too much, that a monarch who answers every betrayal with the harshest possible punishment teaches her court to fear consequence rather than to trust judgment, and a court that only fears consequence will simply become better at hiding its next betrayal rather than abandoning the impulse toward one. Exile without power, watched for the rest of his life by houses that will never again trust him with a fleet, that is a slower, more thorough defeat than a quick execution would have been. He wanted, more than anything, to be remembered as the man who saved this dominion from a queen too weak to hold it. I intend for history to remember him instead as the man who tried to burn it down and watched it hold anyway, because of a choice he mocked in an Ascension Hall and never once managed to unmake. The fairy quarter changed too, in the months that followed, in ways Kellen hadn't expected and hadn't asked for but found himself, quietly, grateful to have caused. Elira's first formal act after the trial concluded was a household reform. Human labor contracts brought under the same safety and inspection standards as Viren caste work. the deferred maintenance backlog that had nearly killed her on Pier 6 months before finally funded and cleared within a season. A formal seat created on the Household Labor Council for a human representative elected from the quarter itself, the first such seat in the Dominion's history. Kellen's old union rep, a weathered woman named Dessay who'd spent 15 years filing requisitions that never cleared in time, took that seat within the month and wrote him a short, blunt letter that he kept folded in his coat for weeks afterward. Never thought I'd live to see the day a dockworker's promotion fixed more pipes than my whole career of complaining did. Proud of you, Voss. Don't let the palace make you soft. He visited the quarter twice in those months, once quietly, once with a full household escort Elira insisted on over his objections, and both times found himself stopped in the street by people he'd worked beside for a decade, most of whom had assumed, when the summons came for him that first morning, that he was being arrested for something, and none of whom had imagined the actual shape of what had happened since. They still don't quite believe it, he told Elira, after the second visit, the two of them alone in her private study, the evening lamps burning low. A dockworker becoming protector to the throne. Half of them think it's a story getting bigger in the retelling. The other half think I'm about to get quietly replaced the moment it's politically convenient. And what do you think? Elira asked, setting aside the report she'd been reading. I think, Kellen said slowly, that 4 months ago I'd have agreed with the second half. I think somewhere between a pier collapse and a coronation hall, I stopped thinking of this as something that could be taken back. Elira was quiet for a moment, studying him with an expression he'd come to recognize over the months, not the careful composure she wore in council, not even the fierce urgency he'd seen twice now over his own bleeding body, but something steadier than either, something that had been building, unhurried and deliberate, since a quiet evening on a gold-lit terrace weeks before the coronation. Then perhaps, she said, it is time we stopped speaking of it only as something that could be taken back, and started speaking of what it has actually become. It was not, in the end, a swift declaration made in the heat of relief and survival, the way Kellen half expected it to be. Elira had spent 8 years learning to be careful with anything the Dominion might one day use against her, and she was careful with this too, in a way Kellen came to understand was its own kind of honesty, not hesitation, but the deliberate pace of someone who wanted whatever came next to be built to last through more than a single grateful season. They spent the autumn that followed simply learning each other outside the shape of crisis. Walks through the palace gardens that had nothing to do with security sweeps, evenings where Elira taught him the old Viren characters etched into the coronation hall's floor, ones he'd walked across for months without ever being able to read the war they told, evenings where he taught her, in exchange, how to strip and reseal a coolant valve, badly at first, her hands unused to the work. Laughing at herself in a way the court almost never got to see. Wren found them at it once, in a maintenance corridor beneath the palace neither of them had strictly needed to be in, and simply shook his head and walked on without comment, though Kellen caught him telling the story, weeks later, to a visiting border house lord with unmistakable fondness. There was one final complication, small compared to everything that had come before it but sharp enough in the moment to remind them both how recently the danger had passed. A loyalist faction within Dreith's old fleet postings, 3 ships' worth of officers who had never been directly implicated in the trial, but had clearly absorbed enough of the marshal's resentments to act on them independently, attempted a clumsy, poorly coordinated seizure of a border supply depot 6 weeks after the coronation, apparently believing that a symbolic strike against Dominion infrastructure might rally wider sympathy for their exiled patron. It did not. Wren's remaining loyal fleets put the attempt down within a day, the 3 ships' crews surrendering without significant bloodshed, once it became clear no wider uprising was coming to support them, and the incident's chief lasting effect on the palace was Elira's brief, sharp fury at learning Kellen had insisted on personally accompanying the response fleet's command staff to the depot rather than remaining, as she'd ordered, safely within the palace walls. "You are not simply a man with a pipe wrench anymore, Kellen Voss," she told him afterward, more exasperated than truly angry, though the exasperation was real enough. "You are the Dominion's confirmed protector, publicly, formally, in front of every house that watched you hold a coronation hall. That title carries weight I need you to respect, even when respecting it means staying somewhere safer than you would prefer." "Somewhere safer than you," Kellen said, "isn't somewhere I know how to be anymore. Figure that's on you, honestly. You're the one who chose a man built that way." She did not have a ready answer to that, and did not, he noticed, try particularly hard to find one. The formal ceremony, when it finally came, arrived not as a surprise, but as the natural conclusion of a season both of them had spent, quietly and deliberately, walking toward it. A season in which the court's whispered doubts about the human protector had curdled, fully now, into something the old nobles who'd once laughed openly in the Ascension Hall would never have predicted feeling. A kind of proprietary pride, the specific satisfaction of a court that had watched an outsider prove himself thoroughly enough that claiming to have supported him from the start had quietly become the fashionable position, regardless of how many of them actually had. Elira called it a recognition right, older than the trial of Worth statute Dreeth had once weaponized against him, older even than the Ascension ceremony itself, a ritual so rarely invoked in recent generations that the court archivist had to dig 3 separate texts out of the deepest palace records to confirm its exact wording. It was not, Wren explained to Kellen carefully in the days before, quite the same as a Viren marriage bond. The Dominion's laws around succession and consort status were older and more particular than either of them had time to fully untangle before the day arrived. But it was, in every way that mattered to the two people actually standing at its center, a formal, permanent, publicly witnessed declaration that could not be quietly unmade by a future council, a future rival, or a future doubt. The hall was full again on the appointed day, the same vaulted ceiling, the same mosaic floor Kellen had once found himself unable to read, the same 200 nobles who had gasped in shock 4 months before at a queen naming a dockworker her protector. This time, when Elira rose from the throne and Kellen came to stand before her at the base of the dais steps, the hall did not gasp. It went, instead, entirely and reverently silent, in a way that felt to Kellen less like the stunned silence of his first day in that room, and more like the deliberate hush of people who already knew what they were about to witness, and had come specifically to see it confirmed. Commander Wren stood at Kellen's shoulder, in the formal role of witness the old rite required, his scarred jaw set with a pride he made no effort to hide. Sale stood near the front of the assembled household staff, silver-gray eyes bright, having asked for and been granted leave to attend rather than serve that day. Somewhere near the back of the hall, Kellen caught sight of Dessa, his old Union rep, in a borrowed formal coat that clearly fit her badly, and that she was clearly, fiercely proud to be wearing anyway. There, as the Fairy Quarter's first formally invited representative to a palace ceremony in the Dominion's recorded history. Elira spoke the rite's opening words in the old dialect first, her voice carrying without strain to every corner of the vast hall, and then, breaking with tradition in a way the archivist had assured her was permitted though rarely chosen, repeated them again in Kellen's own tongue, so that every word of what she was declaring would be understood as clearly by the man standing before her as by the assembled houses behind him. 4 months ago, she said, I named this man my protector before a hall that did not believe he deserved the honor, because I had already tested his worth in the one arena that mattered most to me, a moment when no one was watching, when nothing required it of him, and he gave everything he had anyway. I have watched him prove that worth a dozen times since, in front of assassins, in front of a champion's blade, in front of a collapsing ceiling, in front of 30 drawn weapons in this very hall. I have watched him hold a line no trained soldier should have been able to hold, not because he was born to it, but because he decided, somewhere in a life this dominion never bothered to notice until it needed him, that some things are worth standing in front of even when the cost is high and the odds are worse. She stepped down from the dais then, closing the distance between them fully, until she stood before him rather than above him, and took both his hands in hers in front of the entire watching hall. "I do not offer you a crown, Kellen Voss," she said, quieter now, though the hall's stillness carried her words to every ear regardless. "I do not need you to rule beside me, and I do not believe you would want that or be made better by it. I offer you what I should have understood on a collapsing pier 6 months before I ever knew your name, that you had already given me freely and without condition recognition. Not of a title, not of a duty performed, of a man who chose, again and again, to be worth choosing. I recognize you before this dominion as the equal of any crown I have ever worn, and I ask you, in front of every witness gathered here, whether you will stand beside me, not beneath me and not behind me, for as long as we are both given to stand at all." Kellen had spent 4 months learning the weight this room could carry, and had never once, in all that time, felt it press down on him the way it did now, in the silence that followed her question, not the crushing weight of judgment he'd felt on the day of his naming, but something else entirely, something that asked nothing of him except the truth he'd already been carrying for months without a formal enough occasion to say it aloud. "I pulled a stranger out from under a collapsed pier because it was the only thing to do, and I didn't think twice about it," he said, his own voice steady despite everything the room's stillness pressed against him. "I've thought twice about everything since, about every fight, every wound, every night I sat by a door because I couldn't stand not knowing you were safe on the other side of it, and every single time the answers come out the same. I'm not standing beside you because a right tells me to, or because a court finally decided I'd earned the right to. I'm standing here because somewhere in the last 4 months, I stopped being able to imagine standing anywhere else, and I don't want to spend whatever years I've got left pretending that isn't true. Yes, I'll stand beside you. Not beneath you, not behind you. Beside you, for as long as you'll have me, which I'm hoping, Majesty, turns out to be a considerably longer stretch than either of us has any right to expect, given how the last 4 months went." That earned him a real laugh from her, bright, unguarded, the kind he'd only ever heard from her in private before, and hearing it ring out across that vast silent hall, watching the assembled house's careful court composure crack into something warmer at the sound of it, Kellen understood that whatever record this dominion kept of the day, that laugh would be the part people remembered longest. Elira pressed 2 fingers to the inside of his wrist, the same old gesture that had sealed the bond 4 months before, skin to pulse, and this time she did not simply hold it a moment and release. She turned his hand over, palm to palm, and laced her fingers through his in front of the entire watching hall, and the old right's final words, spoken together this time, her voice and his both, in a hall that had spent 4 months learning exactly how much weight a single choice could carry, closed the distance between the collapsing pier and this vaulted stone chamber completely, until there was no version of the story left that did not end with the two of them standing exactly where they stood now. The hall erupted then, not into the stunned silence of his naming day, but into something the archivists would later struggle to find precedent for in 3 centuries of ceremonial record: applause, real and sustained, from nobles who 4 months earlier had openly questioned whether a dockworker belonged in their midst at all, from foreign delegations who had watched the coronation hall's chaos with their own eyes and understood exactly what they were applauding, from Sale in the front row with tears standing openly in her silver-gray eyes, from Dissad near the back whooping in a manner entirely unbefitting household protocol, and clearly not caring in the slightest. Wren waited until the worst of the noise had settled before he stepped forward, and when he spoke, His voice carried the particular gravity of a man who had spent 30 years training warriors and had, in this one instance, trained something he had not expected to. "I have stood witness to 11 recognition rites in my service to this throne," he said. "I have never once in any of them believed the words being spoken as completely as I believe them today. 4 months ago I asked this man whether he knew the sword, and he told me no, and I thought I understood in that moment exactly what kind of protector the Queen had chosen, and exactly how long he would likely last. I have rarely in my career been more grateful to have been so thoroughly wrong." He turned to the assembled houses. "Let it be recorded formally in the Dominion's history that the finest protector this throne has bonded in 3 generations came to us not from the Blade Guard's ancient halls, but from a pier collapse in the ferry quarter, and that the lesson in it, for every house watching, for every generation that reads this record after us, is that worth was never the exclusive property of the castes that claimed to guard it." Among the foreign delegations still present in the hall for what should have been only a formal seating, a Border Dominion ambassador named Corvessa Thal, whose own government had spent decades quietly debating whether humans encountered along their shared frontier warranted treaty status or merely tolerance, sent a dispatch home that night that would later be read into her own government's records. That she had watched a single unarmed by reputation human hold a haul of drawn blades for 4 minutes against overwhelming numbers, had watched him take wound after wound without once stepping back from the one person he had sworn to protect, and had watched 30 trained killers lay down their weapons not from fear of superior force, but from the plain, dawning recognition that the man in front of them could not be made to yield. Her dispatch did not recommend caution toward humanity. It recommended, in language her government would spend the following year arguing over, that any dominion still treating human worlds as a lesser concern was making a wager it could not afford to lose twice. It became, in the months that followed, something closer to a turning point than either Kellen or Elira had fully anticipated on the day itself. The ferry quarters labor reforms, which might otherwise have remained a single generous act by a grateful queen, easy enough for a future council to quietly walk back once the crisis that prompted them had faded from memory, instead became the first thread in a wider unraveling of the caste assumptions that had shaped the Dominion for longer than anyone in that hall could remember living without. Dissaz's seat on the Labor Council was joined, within the year, by 2 more human representatives from other quarters across Dominion space, each election watched more closely than the first had been, each one a little less remarkable than the one before it. Blade Guard recruitment, which had for 11 generations drawn exclusively from recognized warrior castes, opened cautiously, controversially, but undeniably, to candidates from beyond those bloodlines, Commander Wren himself arguing the case before the council with a bluntness that left little room for the old objections to hide behind tradition alone. "I have led this guard for 30 years, Wren told the assembled council, on the day the measure finally came to a vote, Kellen watching from his usual place at Elira's shoulder, while the old commander stood alone at the chamber's center in a way Kellen had never once seen him do. I was trained from the age of 6 to believe that only bloodline could produce the discipline our oath requires. I have spent 4 months watching a man who held a coronation hall against 30 blades prove that belief false in every particular that matters. I do not ask this council to abandon standards. I have never in my career asked for lower standards. I ask this council to stop confusing bloodline with the standard itself, because I mistook the two for 30 years, and it very nearly cost this Dominion its throne, while I was busy being certain I already knew where worth could be found." Lord Vesserin, who had spent 8 years addressing his remarks past Elira rather than to her, raised the only formal objection the measure received, and it died on the chamber floor within minutes, unable to survive the plain fact, sitting in every councillor's memory, of exactly what kind of candidate the old system would have excluded. Kellen did not oversee any of it directly. That was not, he came to understand, the shape his role in the Dominion was meant to take, and he was glad of it. He had spent a decade in the ferry quarter learning that the people closest to a problem usually understood its fix better than anyone watching from a palace balcony, and he had no intention of becoming the kind of authority who forgot that lesson just because a right had changed what people called him. He stayed close to Elira's shoulder through council sessions and border negotiations, and the slow, unglamorous work of governing a dominion, still recovering from how close it had come to losing itself from the inside. And he stayed close to the ferry quarter too. In the visits Elira never again tried to talk him out of, walking the docks in whatever coat kept the wind off, and letting people who'd known him for a decade as the dockworker with the improvised toolkit see, for themselves, that the man standing beside a queen in the palace records was still, underneath all of it, the same one who'd pulled strangers out of collapsing wreckage because it was the only thing to do. Dreith, from his exile on the border penal world, sent no further word, made no further move. Wren's people watched him regardless, patient and thorough, for longer than either Kellen or Elira found themselves needing to think about him at all. His name faded from council sessions within a year, the way names of failed schemes tend to, remembered mostly in the careful, deliberate lessons the Dominion's newer officers were taught about the specific danger of patient men who mistake caution for weakness. The threat that did not fade quite so cleanly came from smaller men who had lost more than the marshal himself, and it came 7 months into that first year, in a form neither Kellen nor Elira had planned for. A warning, scrawled and shoved under the door of Dissaz's ferry quarter office in the middle of the night, telling the quarter's new labor representative to resign her council seat or watch the reforms she'd fought for burn, along with the district that had elected her. It was signed by no one. It did not need to be. Wren's investigators traced the paper stock within 2 days to a small cell of former household officers who had lost commissions and pensions both in the purge that followed Dreith's trial, men with nothing left to lose, and every reason, in their own bitter arithmetic, to want the old order restored badly enough to threaten a woman who had never carried a weapon in her life. Kellen heard about the threat the same evening it arrived, from Dissaz herself, who had traveled to the palace in person rather than trust the message to any channel a frightened clerk might intercept, and who sat across from him and Elira in the private study, with her hands folded tight in her lap and her voice steady in the particular way of someone who had decided fear was a luxury she could examine later. "I'm not resigning," she said, before either of them could ask. "I didn't come here for permission to be scared, Voss. I came here because if they're bold enough to threaten a council seat, they might be bold enough to try something at the depot, and half the quarter's still working double shifts there this week clearing the last of the old backlog. I wanted you to know before it happened, not after." "You did the right thing," Kellen said, and looked at Elira, and saw already in her expression that she'd reached the same conclusion he had. "Wren can have people on the depot by morning. Quiet, not a show of force. The last thing the quarter needs is a palace garrison marching through it looking like an occupation." "Agreed," Elira said. "But quiet does not mean absent, and I would rather you were there yourself, Kellen, if you are willing. Not as a show of anything. As what you have always actually been to that district, one of theirs, standing where it matters, because he chooses to and not because a right requires it." He went the next morning, in his own coat rather than any formal household dress, and spent 3 days walking the depot's shift rotations alongside Wren's quietly embedded people, reading the crowd the way he'd once read a coronation hall for weak seams, not looking for uniforms or blades, but for the particular stillness of men trying too hard to look like they belonged somewhere they didn't. He found them on the 3rd night, 4 former officers, exactly as the paper trail had predicted, attempting to plan a small incendiary charge against the depot's newly reinforced water reclamation housing, the very system Dissaz had proudly reported finished to standard only weeks before. Chosen deliberately, Kellen understood the instant he saw the device. because burning down the first thing the reforms had actually fixed would have said more than any threatening letter ever could. He did not need a pipe wrench this time, and he did not fight alone. Wren's people closed the depot's exits before the 4 men had finished arming the charge, and the confrontation that followed lasted under a minute, ending not in blades drawn, but in 4 exhausted, bitter men laying down a homemade device and putting their hands up the moment they understood the depot's watch had never actually been as thin as they'd been told to expect. But it was Kellen who stood closest when the ringleader, a former mid-ranking officer named Halvorsen, who had lost a 20-year commission in the post-trial purge, spat at his feet rather than surrender quietly. "You think this ends because you caught 4 of us," Halvorsen said. "There are others who remember what this dominion was before a queen decided a dockworker's opinion mattered more than a bloodline's." "Maybe," Kellen said, "but every one of them's going to have to walk past a working water system with your reform's name on it to make that argument, same as you just did. Systems that actually work are a hard thing to argue people back away from once they've had a season of not worrying whether the pipes are going to fail on them. That's not something a threat note undoes." He looked past Halvorsen to the depot workers who'd gathered, cautious and wide-eyed, at the edge of the confrontation once the danger had passed, men and women he'd worked beside for a decade, watching now with an expression that had nothing to do with fear of him at all. "Ask them if they want the old bloodline back. I think you already know the answer, or you wouldn't have needed a threat letter and a bomb instead of a ballot." Dessa kept her seat. The depot's reforms held, and the story of it traveled through the ferry quarter in the particular way stories travel through districts that have learned to trust very little from anyone above them, carefully, skeptically, and then, once enough people had confirmed it themselves, completely, until it became simply one more thing the quarter understood about the man who had once been theirs and had somehow, without ever quite leaving, become something more without stopping being that. A year to the day after the Ascension coronation, Kellen found himself back on the same terrace where an assassin's blade had once touched Elira's throat, where a queen had once told him, in the gold light of a dying evening, that she had decided a certain danger was worth carrying anyway. The terrace looked the same stone rail, the same view out over Versi's spires catching the last of the day's light, but he found, standing there now with a full year of scars and council sessions and quiet evenings behind him, that it no longer felt like the place where the worst night of his old life had nearly become the last night of any life at all. It felt, instead, like the place where he had first started to understand what he was actually standing guard over, and it had never really been a throne. Elira found him there, as she often did on quiet evenings, and came to stand beside him at the rail without needing to be asked, close enough that her shoulder rested against his arm, the particular closeness that had stopped, sometime in the last year, requiring any formal occasion to justify itself. "Sale tells me," she said, "that the ferry quarter's new water reclamation system passed its final inspection this morning. No deferred maintenance requisitions. No union foreman signing off on work nobody actually did. She says the workers are calling it the first system in the quarter's history built to standard the first time, rather than patched to survive one more season." "Good," Kellen said, and meant it more simply than most things he said anymore, 4 months of court language having taught him gradually, when plain words still served better than careful ones. "That's one less peer that's going to go down on somebody someday." "That is what I love about you, I think," Elira said, and it was the first time in the year since the recognition rite that she had said the word so plainly, without wrapping it in the careful language of thrones and duty, and rights older than either of them. And Kellen felt the plainness of it land somewhere deeper than the formal words of the ceremony ever had, precisely because it hadn't been performed for a watching hall at all, only spoken quietly, between the 2 of them. On a terrace that had seen the worst night of their lives, and, a year on, was only being asked to hold something considerably gentler. You measure the whole of what we have built this year, a throne stabilized, a dominion's oldest castes finally beginning to crack open, a marshal's coup ended before it could start a war, and the thing you choose to be glad about tonight is one less peer. It's not really about the peer, Kellen said. It's about every person who's ever going to walk across it not knowing how close it came to failing, because somebody finally cared enough to fix it before it did. That's most of what mattered to me before I ever met you, Elira. Turns out it's most of what still matters now. You just gave me a bigger set of peers to worry about. She laughed, that same unguarded sound from the recognition right, quieter now, meant for no one but him, and turned to face him fully, the last of the day's gold light catching in her pale violet eyes the way it had on that first terrace evening a year and a lifetime ago. When I chose you on that dais, she said, I told the court I was choosing the one man who pulled me from a collapsing pier without asking who I was first. I have had a year now to understand that it was never really about the pier either. It was that you looked at a stranger buried in wreckage and decided, before you knew anything else about her, that she was worth every risk it took to get her out. I have spent 8 years on a throne being measured by my birth, my bloodline, my mother's legacy. You are the only person in this dominion who has ever measured me by nothing but what I did in front of you, in the moment it mattered most. I chose you because you had already, unknowingly, shown me exactly the kind of person you were. I would choose you again tomorrow, and every day after, for exactly the same reason. Good, Kellen said again, softer this time, reaching over to take her hand the way he had 100 times now, on this terrace and a dozen others, in infirmaries and council antechambers and quiet evenings that had nothing to do with duty at all. Because I already told a whole hall full of nobles I wasn't planning on standing anywhere else. Figured that ought to count for something more permanent than a year. It does, Elira said. It counts, Kellen Voss, for exactly as long as we are both given to keep standing here. And I find, watching what this last year has already built out of a single choice on a dais, that I am no longer even slightly afraid of how long that might turn out to be. Sale found them there a while later, as she often did on evenings when the palace's business had finally quieted enough to let her deliver a message in person rather than through some formal channel, and she paused a respectful distance from the rail before either of them noticed her, watching the two of them with an expression Kellen had come to recognize over the year, not the nervous formality of her first months in the household, but something settled and easy. The look of someone who had stopped needing to be told her place mattered and simply knew it. Forgive the interruption, she said, when Kellen finally turned and waved her forward. I only wanted you both to know before the evening report reaches the council in the morning. The Labor Council confirmed the third quarter representative seat today. A young woman from the shipyards this time, no older than I was when I first came to serve in this palace. She asked, apparently, that her formal address to the council open with a line about a dockworker who once said hello to children carrying heavy tools, and about a queen who decided that mattered more than a bloodline. I thought you would want to hear it before it became part of the official record. Kellen felt Elira's hand tighten briefly around his at that, and did not trust his own voice for a moment, thinking of a girl on a ferry quarter street a year and a lifetime ago, tipping her head back to ask if he was really going to be the queen's husband. Tell her, he managed finally, that she doesn't need to open with any of that. Tell her to open with whatever she came to say. That's the whole point of a seat like that. It's supposed to be about what she has to say next, not about what got her the chair. I told her something very close to that myself, Sale said, though I confess it did not stop her from wanting to say it anyway. I think, Protector Voss, you may simply have to accept that this is what happens now when people tell your story. You do not get to edit it out of gratitude just because you would rather it stayed quiet. She left them to the evening after that, her footsteps fading back toward the palace's lit windows, and for a while neither Kellen nor Elira spoke again, both of them turning the small news over in the comfortable quiet that had, somewhere in the last year, become as natural between them as the silences on the pier had once been strange. "You could have told her the truth," Elira said eventually, a faint smile in her voice. "That you do not, in fact, mind it nearly as much as you pretend to." "Don't tell Wren," Kellen said. "He's insufferable enough already." They stood together at the rail as the last gold light faded from Versy's spires, and the city's lamps rose to take its place. One small, ordinary evening among all the ones that had led to it and all the ones still waiting to come. And neither of them needed to say anything further, because everything that had mattered, the pier, the dais, the terrace, the coronation hall, the rite, had already been said in 100 small moments, by two people who had chosen, over and over, to keep choosing each other anyway.